It's 10:30 and we're going to get started. I'll just introduce briefly our speakers. This is the session on supportive housing. We are having this session because we frequently work with communities that want to develop land for affordable housing, which is fantastic. They maybe have a piece of land and they say, could we make it for seniors? Could we target it for disabled individuals? Could we, how do we do that so that it's a targeted audience? And it's a little more complicated than it sounds. So we thought we'd get some real pros in here. We have Sarah McKeever from CDAC, which is the Community Economic Development Assistance Corporation, and Emily Rothschild from NeighborWorks Housing Solutions to talk about it. So I'm just going to hand it over to Sarah. You're the first speaker, and we'll take it from there.
All right, let's see if this works. We are going to sit because personally I'm wearing heels, so standing while I do this would be hard. And I'm also going to see if I can handle two things and not gesture like this too much. So as Katie said, I'm Sarah McKeever from CDAC, and CDAC is a public-private community development financial institution that provides project financing and technical expertise for community-based and other nonprofit organizations engaged in effective and community development in Massachusetts. So I just wanted to point out, as it says up there, we manage the state bond funds for supportive housing for EOHLC. We do a lot of work in housing preservation, and we have a sister agency that's the Children's Investment Fund, and they help nonprofit community-based childcare centers do facility improvements. There we go. So one of the first things that I want to talk about is what CDAC does. So CDAC provides loans to nonprofits. This is our early stage lending. We do acquisition loans to purchase a site. We also do pre-development loans, which is early development costs. This is your environmental engineer. This is your architect. This is your development consultant, your lawyer. All these people who would like to get paid probably before you get to construction. And I just put some stats up there. I'm not going to read them because you guys can all see them, but we have been doing this for about 45 years now. Do I have to point this somewhere? That way?
No, at the slide.
I got nothing. I got nothing. Oh, there we go.
Here if need be, but
There.
see that clicker. It may not be on.
Okay. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about our early stage underwriting, so things that we think about. So when we underwrite potential projects, we are looking at capacity of the developer team and the developer themselves. If the developer has never completed an affordable or supportive housing project in the past, we will recommend that they partner with an agency that has done so, or they hire a development consultant to shepherd them through the process. We also underwrite the financial capacity of the borrower, which means we look at audited financials, the organizational capacity. Do they have a real estate staff person or team? What other projects are they working on right now, and what stage in the development process are they at? And last but not least, we are going to look at the feasibility of a project. So where is the site? Is it near public amenities, such as restaurants, grocery stores, parks, hospitals, other services? Is there access to transportation or a plan for providing transportation, like a van service or taxi vouchers? What will the team need to do to get zoning approval? Is the project seeking to use, what kind of relief is needed? Is it building height, setbacks, parking? Is the team seeking to use the Dover Amendment, which is an educational use in the bylaws of nonprofits, teaching skills, including independent living? What is the process for Dover in that community? And I think Emily is going to speak to that a little bit more later. Are there any environmental issues or concerns at the site? Are there wetlands or endangered species nearby? Does the project have local support? And we mean both the neighborhood, does the community support the project, and is the locality able to provide financing to the project? We're also looking at, are you applying to the state and the city for appropriate array of financing? And then what are their assumptions around operating income and expenses? So as you can see, our job is to ask a lot of questions. That's really what I do all day long, is ask questions. And then, as I just the last bullet there, if we are providing an acquisition loan, we will look to the as-is of value of the land. And that will help you later when you apply to the state, because that is something that the state is going to look for as well. Did you take my clicker? There you go. Thank you. Excellent. So since we're talking about supportive housing, I think we just wanted to give a brief overview of what is supportive housing. There is a wide range, not one size fits all, right? So it's affordable housing with supportive services available to the residents. It can be housing for seniors, survivors of domestic violence, formerly homeless families, individuals, people with disabilities. I'm probably not covering all of them, veterans, unaccompanied youth. So there's a wide range of populations that can be served with supportive housing. Supportive housing can be one project. So we see projects that are 10 to 20 units that are all dedicated to one population, or there can be a larger project that has a set aside in the project for supportive housing. So next slide, please. So if you have done any sort of training on supportive housing ever, you will hear someone talk about the three legs of the stool. This is what we always talk about, because it's a really good way to talk about the things that you need, right? You need capital, you need operating, and you need services. And so the capital is, how are you going to pay to build this project? And the operating is, how will the project pay ongoing costs of operations? How are you going to pay your insurance, your real estate taxes, your utilities, et cetera? And then how will the project pay for services? Next slide, please. That's not just me. All right, so one of the other roles that CDAC plays at the state level is that we serve as the agent for the soft debt programs that the Executive Office of Housing and Livable Communities has for supportive housing. These funds are HIF, FCF, CBH, FCF, HIPSTIF, AAHG, and ARPA-SH, and I will tell you which each of those acronyms stands for, don't worry. But I just want to point out that there are other additional programs that EOHLC manages that can be used for supportive housing projects. These are just the programs that CDAC manages. So going back to the top, HIF is the Housing Innovations Fund. And this is what Kate Racer, if you know her, would call one of the workhorses of the state. We do a lot of supportive housing with HIF. This is for nonprofits building supportive housing. And again, that sort of covers that range of veterans, seniors, unaccompanied youth, et cetera. Facilities Consolidation Fund is FCF. This is financing for community residences for clients of the Department of Mental Health or the Department of Developmental Services. This includes both group homes and integrated housing options. Community-based housing, that's CBH. This is funding for the development of integrated housing for people with disabilities who would otherwise be at risk for homelessness or institutionalization. Accessibility Affordable Housing Grant is AAHG. This is also funding for integrated accessible housing for people with disabilities. And it is primarily targeted to individuals that have a AHVP voucher, which is an alternative housing voucher program. And happy to provide any of these acronyms to anybody if you'd like later. And then HIPSTIF and ARPA-SH are very, very similar to HIF. HIPSTIF is actually no longer available. It was a funding source about 5 years ago. And ARPA-SH is fully committed at this point, so probably out of it, so no point applying for any more of it because it comes with federal deadlines as well. So as I said, these loan products can mix with other sources, so it blends with low-income housing tax credits and other state and local soft debt. So next slide, please. Thanks. So this is just a sense of the volume. As I said, CDAC's been doing this for about 45 years. You can see that the HIF program is the oldest program since 1988. And sort of as we have continued to do our work with the state, other funds have become available over time. Next slide, please. Thanks. All right, so on to the second leg of the stool, operating. So supportive housing tenants are frequently very low income. So they often receive income and from disability benefits, right? So project-based rental assistance from local housing authorities or HLC, sorry, I'm gonna abbreviate EOHLC to HLC all the time. That just comes out. It's easier to say. Can help the project with operations, right? So this means that an individual is going to pay a small percentage of their income towards rent, and that the administrating agency is going to provide that balance to get the project to receive a market rent. This will help with you paying your utilities, your insurance, your taxes. So examples of rental assistance, I'm sure everyone has heard of Section 8s. There's also the MRVP program, which don't think I've ever said the whole name before, but it's the Massachusetts Rental Voucher Program, and that's an EOHLC program. There's also 811s, which HLC will administer as well, and there's VASH, which are vouchers primarily for veterans. Next slide, please. Excellent. Okay, so on to services. So funding for services, it's a bit of a mishmash. I'm just gonna put that out there. So there should be some project operating income because you're getting money from rent, you're getting project-based vouchers, so there's income that you should be able to dedicate towards supportive services. There are also service providers that have state contracts, primarily with EOHHS, which is the Executive Office of Health and Human Services for the state. So this includes the Department of Public Health, Department of Mental Health, Department of Developmental Disabilities, Mass Rehab Commission, et cetera. I'm probably missing somebody. If the project is serving seniors, sponsors should reach out to the local council on aging. There's aging service access points, which we like to call ASAPs. They can provide services, sometimes for no cost, sometimes for a small cost to the project. There's also what we call a PACE Center, which is a program for all-inclusive care for the elderly. And that is related to seniors that are on mass health, I believe under 55, and I can verify that, are eligible for services at a PACE Center. And then finally, one more. So if the project is serving homeless households, whether individuals or families, the sponsor should look into MAHASA, which is the Massachusetts Housing and Shelter Alliance for Home and Healthy Good program, which we call HHG. Also, Mass Health's Community Support Program for Homeless Individuals, CSPHI, formerly known as CSPEC, provides money for services. And then there's always fundraising. And I say that because a lot of these projects that are built by nonprofits that are mission driven and their whole goal is to serve a certain population. And so a lot of these sponsors can raise some serious money. Not everybody. I'm not gonna, but some of them can do that, which is really nice. Next slide, please. So you have some money for services hopefully identified. You're putting together a supportive service plan and a budget. And CDAC's role and EOHLC's role is to look at your supportive service plan and your budget, and we're going to ask a lot of questions. But one of the things to keep in mind is we're looking at track record. So does the developer have a track record of providing these services to this population? If not, they should really enter into a partnership. So if you are a local CDC, you want to prepare a supportive service project, go look, there's service agencies in the community. They could provide services. And if you do that, we want to see a document that documents your relationship with that service provider. So there should be a memorandum of understanding. There should be a written agreement for what services will be provided and how many employees are going to be on site. Are they going to be on site? Is it a full-time employee? Are they on site every day? Is it half the time? Could be any time, right? And we will also ask to see a full supportive service budget. So sources, uses. What are those sources going to pay for? And where are you getting those sources? And I just want to point out that projects cannot require that a tenant receives services. So the services are available to tenants, but you cannot force people to take services. Next slide, please. So I'm putting it back on my EOHLC hat here. And so I just wanted to point out that HLC runs 3 competitive funding rounds a year. We call them various things, but generally we call them the winter rental round, the mini round, and the supportive housing for vulnerable populations round. So these rounds are all competitive processes, and pre-applications are submitted, and projects that demonstrate readiness will be invited to proceed with a full application. A supportive housing project can go in any one of those doors, but we have smaller projects for the highly vulnerable populations are encouraged to come into that supportive housing round. In the supportive housing round, MRVPs, you might remember them from the operating income slide, those come with a supportive services stipend of $1,500 per unit annually. So it is small money, but it helps that supportive service budget. Next slide. Excellent. All right, I'm getting down to the end of my presentation here. So I think for final thoughts, a couple things. If you've heard from someone in your municipality who would like to do supportive housing and is excited to work with that, we would really like to encourage partnerships. We'd like to encourage development consultants. The process for applying for state funds is not for the faint of heart, right? It's a detailed process. There is a system there. You're doing budgets, you're getting environmental reports, you're hiring contractors and architects and all these people, and it's a little bit like herding cats to get everybody to go in one direction with you at the same time. And then, take advantage of all the great resources that MHP is providing, both at this conference and every day. They can help. CDAC can also help anytime you would like to reach out to me, talk about a supportive housing project. It's what I do all day. I love supportive housing. And with that, I am going to turn it over to my co-presenter, Emily.
Is this working? Yes. Okay. So I'm a developer, not a financer like Sarah. I work with NeighborWorks Housing Solutions. NeighborWorks is a regional nonprofit in southeastern Massachusetts. We develop affordable housing. We provide development consulting predominantly to nonprofit organizations for supportive housing. We manage our own properties. We're the regional housing authority for state operating subsidies in southeastern Massachusetts. And we also provide home buyer counseling and a few other programs. So what I agreed to do today is to tell you some stories about some projects that I've worked on that were initiated by local communities. And the common denominator among these projects is they came to us with a plan, and we talked about the pros and cons, and we talked about what it would take to fund it and develop it. And in each case, the local community was flexible in the process and respected our advice and our experience, and we were able to create a fundable project. Where projects are not successful, I think, is where the folks initiating it are not familiar with the process. They dig their heels in and say, this is what we want to do. We don't care about how the underwriting works, and all of these projects are subject to underwriting. And while there are some things that are codified with the state funding, you really can't do these projects without state funding in Massachusetts. And the key thing is it's subject to underwriting, and it's subject to review of the strength of the development team, the experience, the financial capacity, as well as the capacity to operate. So those are not, codified in a 1, 2, 3 kind of way. So being familiar with the state and their expectations is helpful. And those are changing expectations over time, having done it for 35 years. I started out doing mostly SRO housing where there were shared kitchens and bathrooms, and over time, in probably the last 15 years or more, most of our projects are done as studio apartments, because it just doesn't work as well anymore for folks to be sharing kitchens and bathrooms. And also, I think there was originally an expectation in all of these projects that folks would transition from the early SROs to something else. And now there's a recognition that instead of transitioning people into other facilities, we transition the services as people become more independent. So that we're not moving people around. They can stay as long as they wish and as long as it's useful to them, but they may, over time, require a lesser amount of services. All of the projects I'm going to discuss were done as Dover Amendment projects. I'll just briefly tell you what Dover Amendment is if folks are not familiar with it. The Dover Amendment has been in place since at least the 1980s and perhaps earlier. It's proven case law that for residential programs with an educational component. So in order to have the Dover Amendment zoning use restriction, a project must be developed by a nonprofit with educational purposes that are stated in the Articles of Incorporation. That education within the housing does not require a dedicated classroom. You don't have to have a class. You need to be teaching folks. And often in the projects that I'm doing, that teaching is happening in the context of case management, where case managers are teaching each individual independent living skills according to their specific needs. Not everyone in the house has exactly the same needs. They're not coming from the same place. They have different capacities. So it's teaching people those things. And the Dover Amendment overrides local zoning use restrictions. So generally the way that's handled for pretty much everything I've ever done is we go to the local building inspector, who is the first line of interpretation of the zoning code. We present them with our educational use plan for the project and our arguments based on case law. 99% of the time, they agree with us that the project is exempt from zoning use restrictions. When they don't, we ask them to talk to their city solicitor, who frequently then convinces them that they need to go with this. While it only overrides zoning use restrictions, Dover Amendment only allows the community to impose reasonable restrictions on setbacks, density, parking, et cetera, et cetera. And the kicker is that reasonable is reasonable in the context of the specific site. So that if you're using requirements, parking requirements as a way to stop a project, that would not be reasonable. If you've got 10 individuals on a site and they're single individuals, most of whom won't even have cars, and you're requiring 20 parking spaces, that would not be considered reasonable. So generally, we iron that all out with the building inspector, and the building inspector sends us to the planning board, and then we're not talking about use or setbacks, we're talking about lighting and the design of the site and how do we fit in the community and all that good stuff. And we generally try to anticipate the community's concerns, and we try to create a project that looks attractive and that improves the neighborhood and the streetscape and so on. So anyway, that's Dover Amendment. When we open for questions, if folks have more questions on that, happy to do my best, although I am not an attorney, so I'm not going to try to go too far on it. So I assume someone will stop me if I go too long, but the first project we're going to talk about is in the town of Marshfield. This project was initiated by the town after a tragic loss of a local homeless veteran who had been living in the woods. The community came to NeighborWorks and said, or the local government did, that we have this building in town that's vacant, and we'd like to preserve it because we believe it has historic value, although it wasn't on the historic registry. And we'd like to use it to house homeless veterans, because we know you guys have been doing some of that stuff in other communities. So I honestly wasn't in the very beginning stages of this project. But I think it was always intended that NeighborWorks would be the developer of the project. It was, I think, originally planned to be SROs. We encouraged them to go with studio apartments, especially because at that point that made it a more fundable project. There was a stage in time where the state was not really funding SROs anymore. And it also was just better living for the veterans who would live there. They did have to put the building out for public bid, but they put the bid had the expectation that it would be used as veterans housing, and also they expected that we would create offices for their historic commission. The town was so supportive of the project that we submitted a bid. I think we were the only bidder, but we submitted a bid for $50,000, which was considerably less than what they had bought it back for most recently. But it agreed that we would pay for the cost of developing their historic commission's offices, and that we would charge no rent to the historic commission over time. They might pay their own utilities, but that's it. And then, so they selected us, and on top of that, provided us with $600,000 worth of funding, which was terrific. The process going through the community for approval was very friendly, and the town was just really, really proud of the project, to the point that every time for, I think, at least a year, when I would come to the town offices, they had a board, an easel with a board. The first thing you saw when you walked through the door was a rendering of our project. So that was really wonderful, that the town was so welcoming. As a side thing, which you'll notice there, we're thanking the firemen. Unfortunately, we were nearly complete with construction, and we had a localized fire in the building. I don't think we ever were able to identify the cause. It was in the later stages of construction. It was intense heat in a stairway, so the damages were mostly heat and smoke, but we had to bring it back down to the studs and rebuild it. But ultimately, it was built, and we learned a whole lot about insurance companies, which we never want to deal with again. Oh, yeah, that was 8 units in that project. So it's a nice sort of homey feel.
All single?
Yep, all studio apartments, single person in each unit, and then there's some community space there. And that was completed in 2021. So we had not only a fire, but also a pandemic to deal with. So it was a challenging project, but the people living there are very happy now. And this, had the three-legged stool on this one was we brought in a bunch of money from the state to augment the money that we got from the town. We got state rental vouchers because our folks, when they're homeless, are typically at 30% of median or below. We agree to meet the 30% of median standard, but many of our people are really more like 15% of median. They're just extremely low income. And then Father Bills, who partners quite a bit with NeighborWorks on homeless projects, came in as the service provider on this. And I believe we paid for this services through the rental stream. And basically the trick to doing that is the one cost that you have in operations that's flexible is your debt service. So if we take on less debt service, we can squeeze in a line item for resident services in the operating budget, if we can't get a separate operating contract. When it's housing for people with developmental disabilities or Department of Mental Health clients, those come with state contracts. But when folks are homeless or most of the time veterans, there are not necessarily state contracts that will cover the services, so we squeeze it into the operating budget as best we can. So the second project, can we go to the next slide? There we go. This project is currently in construction. This is a wonderful story. This is in Attleboro for, I think as many as 10 years before we came on board. There was an ad hoc community group of advocates, people who worked with United Way, people who operated shelters in the region, a minister who had operated a shelter out of his church, a bank representative and local state representative. They had been meeting with community members for many years, talking about the need for shelter in Attleboro. There was a lot of street homelessness there. And they recognized that, we got to bring people in off the streets. So after all those years of meetings, they looked at whether they were capable of developing a shelter themselves and came to the conclusion that they really needed help from people with experience. Part of their group was Catholic Social Services, who operates several shelters in Bristol County and northern Bristol County, in Taunton and down in New Bedford. So the intent was that they would operate the shelter, but they were not developers, and didn't want to take on the development aspect of the project. So this ad hoc group, which had formed a nonprofit by the time they approached us, approached NeighborWorks and asked if we would partner with them in some way. At that point, they still thought that they might be the developer and owner of the project. So we talked to them a little bit about, they were completely volunteer board. They didn't have staff, they didn't have experience, and we talked to them about what it would take to develop a project like this and to get it through funding with the state. And they came to realize that probably it didn't make sense for them to try to take this on themselves as a volunteer organization. And we, gently indicated to them that it really wouldn't be fundable that way. We could create a new nonprofit, but it seemed to be an unnecessary amount of complication if they didn't feel strongly about having an ownership interest, which they didn't. They really wanted to just be the catalyst to make this happen. So in the midst of these discussions, we also brought them to see some of the Father Bill's housing projects, and we encouraged them to not only develop a shelter, which is fundable through the state, but at that point when we were talking to them, and this was also beginning of pandemic, there weren't a lot of new shelters being developed. And we said, well, this is really a much more fundable project and much better for the population and the community if we couple the shelter with housing. And they visited some of the housing units we had developed with Father Bill's, these studio apartments for homeless, and they, just thought it was fantastic and that this would be a great asset to their community. And then we took on several years of working with them to find a site. The city was supportive and said, how about a site that they owned that had environmental contamination on it? The contamination had been cleaned, but we looked over the reports and basically it was never going to be fully clean. And it was going to require monitoring. It seemed that it very likely would not be fundable, and if it was fundable, it would add an unnecessary layer of complication to have this ongoing monitoring, in perpetuity and all these questions about the contamination. It was a former industrial site. It was a former factory. I forget what it was used for. It might have been leather, one of those kinds of factories with a lot of chemicals. and it was vacant land at that point. So we moved off of that site. Then the city said, well, we have this building that's underutilized, and we might be able to transfer that. We looked at that, and it was a little too large. It was a little too complicated, and didn't quite fit our purposes to renovate that municipal building. And then we started a search with a real estate agent. Found a small office building that had probably been built, I don't know, 50s, I think. It was kind of worn out, and that was a good site for us. And we looked at tearing down that building, and NeighborWorks got that under agreement. Then the local group, which is their nonprofit, was a Northern Bristol County Assistance Collaborative. Not only initiated the project and facilitated it and did all that early groundwork, but when we came onto the project, they had already gotten a $200,000 multi-year grant from a local bank, Bay Coast Bank. And they also, the State Representative Hawkins, really spearheaded this project and got over several years, I think about 4 or 5 different earmarks for the project. And those were just, a wonderful asset for pre-development. Frequently, we do use CDAC for pre-development, but in this case, we didn't need to because they had done all of this fundraising and brought all of these amenities to the project, and then that funding stayed in the project, and it helped leverage money from the state. So this project is going to be an 18-bed shelter on the first floor. It's about 2/3 of the first floor will be the shelter, and then 22 studio apartments on the remainder of the first floor and on the second and third floors. It will be owned by NeighborWorks, who will manage the property. Catholic Social Services will operate the shelter, and Father Bills will provide the supportive services for the folks living in the housing, because that was not something that Catholic Services wanted to take on for various reasons. Basically the team was flexible, and we were able to work with them to create a fundable project. So it's a win, and we should be opening, I hope, in October if we don't get held up by supply chain issues. But, yeah.
Can I just ask a quick question?
Mhm.
Where did the funding for site acquisition come
I think, excuse me, I think we used a loan from, not PCI, the other insurance, Life Initiative, yeah. I believe we did. But it was it was Attleboro, and it really wasn't, a big cost. We also were collecting rents for almost a year of the remaining tenants. It was only 4 office units. When we brought it under agreement, we, as part of the agreement, said that we would rent 2 of the office units so that they would keep them vacant. And we didn't, because we didn't want to have relocation. And the other 2 had leases that were ending. So we collected the rent until their leases ended. Yeah. So next slide. Okay. So this project is in Randolph. This one was not initiated by the local community. It was initiated by the local bank. Started out as, I think they were Randolph Savings Bank when we first started talking to them, and merged with Envision Bank. So this is Envision Bank Home for Veterans. This is 10 studio apartments for homeless veterans. They came to us and said, at that point, it was soon after we had developed, or Father Bills had developed a house for homeless veterans in Hingham. And that was, I think, 6 SRO units for homeless veterans. And the bank said, we've heard about this project in Hingham. We think it's a great idea. We have this vacant lot adjacent to the bank that we'd like to use to help homeless veterans. And in addition to our bank owning the lot, we also have a foundation I can't recall whether the foundation was exclusively to help veterans, but they definitely wanted to use their foundation money to help serve homeless veterans. So they came to Father Bill's and said, how can we make this work? And, who should develop it? And do we, again, create a combined organization, or would Father Bill's be the developer? So we talked to their group, and it was a fairly small lot that was, I think, originally maybe a two-family house, and it was vacant at the time they started talking to us. And the intent was that the bank would donate this lot to Father Bill's. So one of the first things we said was, well, it really would work better to do studio apartments than SROs. And they were open to that. And then in our minds, for the amount of effort, basically, a project takes the same amount of effort whether you're creating 10 units or 30 units. And while we certainly we like to do smaller projects that fit into the community, it isn't very cost effective to do 6 units. So we tried to see what we could fit on the lot. And as we looked at it, we looked at it was adjacent to the bank and their parking lot. And as everybody knows, banks used to be more customer friendly. People would come into the bank and you needed a big parking lot. And in recent years, people do a lot of banking online, and they had this parking lot which probably had about, 50 spaces or so. And you never saw more than 5, 6, 7 cars parked in there. So we said, it doesn't hurt to ask. We said, listen, you've got all this parking here. We just have this lot, which was big enough for the house and a driveway, I guess, originally. Could you slice off part of your parking lot and give us that as well? Because they were giving us the land that had been originally the house. And they said, sure. It was really a very easy ask. And, to their credit, it was, wonderful of them, and it made the project work. Because we needed some parking for our project, not necessarily because the people needed parking spaces, but we needed to comply with the local requirements. So we try to do 1 parking space per unit when we can. Typically, when we're doing housing for homeless folks, we really don't find more than 10% of our people have cars, but since they're staying there long-term, doesn't hurt to have a few extra. So anyway, they subdivided off that land, they donated the land to us, and on top of that, they gave us a $500,000 multi-year grant. Then the town of Randolph came in with $100,000 of CPC funding, which was a huge help, and helped us to leverage state funding, because the state really expects the local community to come in with funding. And that was done with Dover Amendment. And we opened in 2021. Also in the midst of a pandemic. A lot of work happening. So I think do we have time for one more?
Yeah.
Okay. So my last slide is, that came out pretty good. This is the Yawkey Housing Resource Center and Broad Street Housing. This project was, in a way, initiated by the city of Quincy, because the city of Quincy was looking to develop a new municipal public safety complex. And adjacent to where they were developing their new police department, fire department, and so on, I think Department of Public Works also, was a building that they had leased for, at least 30, 40 years to Father Bill's for a homeless shelter. And they needed that land that the homeless shelter was sitting on to make this municipal project work. So we found a way to make this a win-win for everybody. So while the initial incentive was to move the shelter, Father Bill's talked to the city over quite some time. The city agreed to provide some land across the street from the existing shelter with a 100-year land lease. And Father Bill said, let's take these lemons and make lemonade. And They've created a much better program than the original shelter was. They now have a housing resource center, which allows them to be open 24 hours a day instead of a typical shelter where people come in about 4 in the afternoon and get kicked out at 7 in the morning and have to wander the streets in between. This has 24-hour availability, and not just during snowstorms. And then on top of that, it has extensive services available for the folks in the shelter, case management services, employment services. It has on-site a health clinic. It has an infirmary. It has respite beds for people with health needs that need medical assistance. And then it has, the typical shelter with, group dormitories. Although one of the nice things that we were able to add with a newly constructed shelter was we have sleeping alcoves. So instead of being in a room with, 50 to 100 people, all, beds one after another, we have dividers. So each bunk bed has a divider around it for a little bit of privacy, which is a real nice thing. And then we were, on top of converting the shelter to a housing resource center, we were able to create 30 units of supportive housing. So we started with, your shelter's got to move, to working together with the community to create this much better facility than what we had for all those years. The city came in and provided $1 million from their housing trust fund, and also got us a $250,000 housing choice grant from the state. So that was a big help. And then the land that they leased to us, they leased at no cost. So we got enough land to build this, it's about 130 bed shelter, plus 30 studio apartments at no cost. So that is a huge help to make the project feasible. And this one opened earlier this year, I think January of 2024. So it's been a fantastic asset to the community and to the folks living there. And I think we can take questions.
I'm sure there's a lot of questions, so we'll walk the mic around. I'm going to start just because I want to. A lot of communities we talk to want to talk about local preference. How did that work with these project examples that you were showing?
Local preference can be challenging with these projects. First of all, when you ask a developer to do a local preference and you're subject to fair housing and you're using state funding, although I'm not I guess it's because you're using state funding. The local preference can only be imposed on the initial lease up. As units turn over, the local preference will no longer apply. So if you have a developer come to you and say they're giving you a local preference, you kind of have to ask another couple of questions, because that's what they're going to end up telling you. And the local preference can only be a certain percentage of the units. That's somewhat negotiated with the state. The other piece to it, though, is that in Massachusetts, and I haven't developed in other states, so I don't know how much it's the case in other states, many of our communities are vastly majority white communities, and we have a handful of communities, I would guess it's somewhere between 10 and 20, that are majority minority communities. So if doing a local preference by definition makes your project in violation of fair housing because you're not open to people of color, then it's problematic. The other thing is that for the populations that I'm focused on, this is really more of a regional problem. So we come to Hingham and they're homeless. They don't have a homeless shelter there. Or Attleboro at the time of starting this, or Marshfield, or Randolph. None of them have local shelters. So if you were serving a homeless population, their homeless have already moved to shelters in adjacent communities. And those adjacent communities have recognized that this is a regional issue, and they're taking care of the whole region's population. So we ask communities to consider a regional responsibility for these populations. One of the ways that we are able to have a local focus in a backdoor way for homeless populations is we've, in recent years, selected tenants from the coordinated entry list. And that's a regional list that prioritizes homeless individuals according to their vulnerability. So their level of disability, how long they've been homeless, do they have intense medical needs? The ranking is constantly changing, and they move to the top if they're most vulnerable. But it's by region. So that way we are able to focus on people from that region. Quite honestly, though, when we go to local communities, and I just went through 2 town meetings this spring, so we heard a lot about what the local communities care about. Most of these folks are not that mobile, and they're not looking to, Boston people are not all looking to move down to Marshfield, and people in Worcester are not all looking to move to Framingham. As a matter of fact, most of them are not. So people tend to like to stay fairly close to where they are unless they have, a really bad experience. They're in recovery from substance abuse and they really need to move an hour away. But they self-select, and even with, again, I don't know how many of you are interested in homeless and maybe more interested in elderly or disabled populations, but with the homeless populations, when they rise to the top of that list, they have a choice. They're offered, they say, okay, you're at the top of the list, we have this unit available, are you interested? They may say, no, I want to wait for another unit that's closer to where I'm familiar. Although similarly with Department of Mental Health and Department of Developmental Disabilities, they also try to place people close to their families or close to their communities of origin or close to where they prefer to live. Certainly with Department of Mental Health, it's, they take into account preferences of the people they're serving. So as much as possible, people do stay in local regions, but a local preference doesn't work as well for supportive housing, and it's hard to comply with fair housing.
Thank you. So the descriptions of both of you were mainly focused on studio apartments, single occupancy. What's the support that's available for couples or caregivers in who need, when you've got a supportive need, but it's not single individual by him or herself?
Sure. Well, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
Okay.
I'm gonna roll it. I'll chime in, don't
Okay,
worry.
please. I'm holding this. So the state in recent years, when they do rental funding rounds, have required the developers to do, is it 5% or 10%? It's either 5 or 10% of their unit, when they do multifamily housing, either 5 or 10% of those units need to be for extremely low income individuals, so 30% of median and under. While it's targeted at that income level, frequently folks at that income level have some disabilities or some needs. You don't necessarily need supportive services just because you're low income, but the disabilities play in there a lot of times when you're getting into such low levels. It's fixed incomes a lot of times. So those folks will get preferences in these larger multifamily projects that have apartments. And when they need services, the services come to them, or they, so a lot of, low-income multifamily rental projects will have case managers to help folks out. They may not have quite as intense needs as our projects that are exclusively homeless, but low-income people, even, at 50% of median, still have needs. So, yeah.
I've known homeless couples, and the fact that they're expected to go to one shelter and another shelter every night to be separate seems inhumane.
Yes.
I mean, we're
Oh, no,
trying
that's
to- we're
different.
trying
That's
to
the
treat
shelter
these people-
system.
Well,
Yeah.
but, I mean,
Yes.
this is an alternative to the
Yes.
shelter system. Or
This is the next step.
An improvement
Yes.
on the shelter
Yes.
system, and it seems not, I mean, I'm
Yes.
pushing for.
Yeah, the shelter system's funded by the state, and basically there are two kinds of shelter. There's single adult shelter, and there's shelter for families with minor children. And there is not a shelter for families with adult children or for couples. You're right. Sorry.
That's all right. I'm just going to chime in. So I think actually the number is now 13% ELI.
Okay.
I believe the QAP has bumped that up for 13% ELI in all projects. But I just want to say that we see a lot. We do see family housing, right? Family housing is, these examples are studios, but family housing is something we see all the time at the state level. And I believe, I'm just quoting off the top of my head, so, I could be wrong, but I believe what we require is like 65% of 2 and 3 bedrooms in those developments. So we are looking for bigger size units in family developments. I think what we find in supportive housing, depending on what level of supportive housing it is, sometimes we'll have 1 bedrooms and a couple, obviously, can live in a 1-bedroom apartment. We also see that for senior deals that we have 1 bedrooms and sometimes 2. We've noticed on some of our projects, we sort of started out doing our community-based housing projects, which are the projects for individuals with disabilities that are accessible. We do sometimes see personal care assistants, and so then they would have a 2-bedroom unit because they need a separate unit for that care person. So I think it's, there's a lot of different flavors out there. So just because the examples that Emily gave were individuals doesn't mean that's all that's out there.
Yeah, that's just what I do.
Yeah.
Hi. I was hoping you could talk about the pros and cons of a land lease rather than selling the land to you, and sort of needs that develop over the decades, sort of if you've leased the land versus purchased it and the building needs repairs in 20 or 30 years, sort of how that plays out.
So, honestly, if I came to a project and I had a preference, my preference would not be to do a land lease. But in certain situations, we're asked to, where the community owns the land and they want to keep control of it, or they need to, rather than subdividing something off. Generally, what we do in that case is a 99-year lease, which is just short. 100 years, it's no longer a lease. So it's set up as a 99-year lease. The ones that I've been involved with don't really have any lease payments. It's just to keep control, a little more control of the land. The buildings are owned completely by the nonprofits and are financeable because it's a 99-year lease, which exceeds the use restrictions and the terms of the mortgages.
I just want to say that if there is a land lease, you need to think of it a little bit like an acquisition in some ways, because the cost that the entity that is leasing the land cannot exceed the value of the appraised. So I'm going to go back on that. So like, if the building is worth $1 million, you can't have this nonprofit or other developer pay more than $1 million in lease payments. So the state will look at that, right, as they're looking at the terms of the lease. And frankly, we love free leases or $1 a year. We see sometimes $1 a year. That's great. Yeah. Right. And I think if this is part of a larger tax credit deal, or if it's just a supportive housing deal that's a larger tax credit deal, there are rules, and I am not a tax credit expert, around how long that land lease has to be. I believe it's 60 years. And that's, again, the sources of funding that I am underwriting, that HLC is underwriting, they come with land use restrictions. So all of my sources have a 30-year land use restriction. You are agreeing to do what you say you are doing for the next 30 years. We would like you to keep doing it longer. We would like you to come back to us and say, I'm still doing this. Can I have a 10-year extension? And we'd be like, sounds great. Other sources that HLC administers have 50-year. Some cities ask for perpetuity, that 99 years. So it's, I personally, also with Emily, I'd prefer if the project is just sold to the nonprofit. It's a little less complicated, but there's ways to structure it.
Thank you. So I work for the state for DCAM, and we've got a couple of projects that are basically kind of supportive housing projects. And one challenge that we've had is kind of the mismatch between the supportive services part of the deal and the other two legs, right? So we want somebody to guarantee us that they're going to provide these services for 99 years. And often, like the way that the real estate documents work and the way that the real estate funding works, that like they can't do that. And so I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit more about the funding for the services. And I think, like Emily, I think you mentioned reduced debt service was how you did it in one case, and I'm wondering how you got somebody to agree to let you pay less on your debt, or that there might be other kind of sources that CDEC has that are that fund services. So I'd love to hear more about funding services and how that relates to the rest of the underwriting for the deal.
So, most services, or at least intense services, are funded through state contracts. State contracts are always subject to appropriations, and I think are rarely more than 5 years at a time. So we do run into this with underwriting, that, the lenders would like to see us be able to commit funding forever. We can't. What the lenders can underwrite for is the track record of the service provider. How long have they been getting these state contracts? If they've been getting contracts for the last 30 years and all their contracts are in good standing and they've got, many, many contracts, they're a larger organization, it's a pretty good gamble, I guess. If they're a tiny organization, they have one state contract, they, even if they've been around a long time, that one state contract could be at risk. That's a different set of issues. The reduced debt service is reduced debt. So what we do, as much as we can, in certain communities, like in Attleboro, we're running on fair market rents because we've got state rental subsidies. The fair market rents in Attleboro are literally half of what they are in Boston. The cost to operate a unit in Attleboro is not half of the cost of operating a unit in Boston. It's pretty much the same. The utilities are pretty much the same. The maintenance is pretty much the same. The insurance, property management costs, et cetera, et cetera. It could be 10% less, but it's definitely not 50% less. So what we said when we brought that project to the state was, with these rents, we cannot afford to take on any bank financing. So we said we need to do this project all with development subsidies, and that's what we did. And because we had no debt service there, that left us room to put in a line item for supportive services. Now, the supportive services are very different on different types of supportive housing projects. On a project with Department of Mental Health or Department of Developmental Disabilities, used to be $40,000 a year. I'm guessing they're up to $60,000 or $70,000 a year now of services. And it used to be, we'd say we need about $5,000 a year for homeless services, maybe 10 now. But it's considerably less. So for a homeless project, we can fit it into the budget that way. For a group residence with intensive 24-hour services and 1 to 4 staffing, that really requires a state contract. The homeless projects tend to be 1 to 15 staffing. Sometimes the overnight staffing is on-call staff versus on site. When it's on site, then we fundraise the difference. It can't be funded entirely with the operating budget. Hope that helps.
Hi, I'm Alice Livedall. I'm from Hubbardston. We have We want to build more senior housing units. We have in town 36 with a 7-year waiting list. They were built in the 80s. And we have a site, which is a gravel pit, but all the contaminated soil is being removed. So here's, here's my question, is when, I know you said the starting point is developing this proposal for the project that addresses all these things. Are there agencies that, or companies that will help you do that?
Yes.
Because, yes, and if I call you, will you?
There's absolutely. So I think my first thing would be to connect you to a local CDC, if there is one nearby, regional, perhaps CDC, or another nonprofit organization. There's also development consultants, which Emily used to be. And she's still, yeah. Development consultants are wonderful because they can do all of that stuff I just talked about. As they can go look at the site, they can talk about what is it worth. They can talk about how to prepare a budget, what the steps you will need, what CDAC frequently calls milestones. Like, what do you need to do next? What is the next step in this project? How do you get it to a feasible project? So if you want to email me, I'm happy to talk to you about it more, and I can send you some consultants or potential organizations.
Perfect, thanks.
Yeah.
I will also chime in and put a plug in for MHP's community assistance team. We also provide that service to communities, particularly at the pre-development when you haven't done anything yet and you need to engage and do some site evaluation. So please also feel free. Why don't we follow up? I can get you my card and we can chat as well.
Great presentation. Thanks to both of you. A question that I had, in terms of the built structure of a supportive housing project compared to like a normal affordable housing development, how do you see that as being different? Maybe in terms of like accessibility, or for the last question, you know, how could you propose a building that would be attractive to the state and to CDAC in order to receive funding? Like, how are those different than a normal affordable housing project?
I mean, I think I can start on a couple things, right? So if you're thinking about a group home scenario, which Emily has mentioned and I've mentioned with the Department of Developmental Services, or DMH, the Department of Developmental Services has design guidelines. They're on our website because they have design guidelines for their group homes, and it is really accessibility that there is that focus, right? And then in general, for supportive housing as a whole, I think one of the things I look to is, you know, you are looking to see, you know, particularly post-COVID, studios having people have their separate bath and kitchen areas, right? Not sharing, sharing germs. And then I think also programming space, right? I think in our supportive housing deals, there is maybe a bit more programming space than there is in another affordable housing deal, right? There's staff that is on site, supportive services. There might be running financial training workshops or case management services. A lot of other things are happening there. But Emily, if I missed anything.
Yeah, I think any supportive housing facility would have, in addition to the housing units, which don't look hugely different from other rental units, certainly enough space for a case management office, as well as property management functions. It may be a shared office. And then depending on the program, some programs do group meetings and group trainings and workshops. In that case, you need community space. In recent years, we've had some service providers who say, we really don't want the community space because it creates space for negative interactions. And on top of that, we want to maximize the number of units. We really want as many units as possible, maximizing, you know, within a 30-unit structure. I'm not saying we're doing 300 units, but if we can get 2 more units by not having a community room, sometimes that's the priority. Other nonprofits prefer to have a community room, and they like that idea of folks being able to come together, maybe watch a football game or get together for holidays and whatnot, or just hang out in the shared kitchen. The community rooms certainly do work better in smaller projects. I think 30 units, it gets a little tricky. 10 units, generally fine. So it's a preference thing, but at minimum, there needs to be case management. We used to say, I've been doing this for 35 years, and when we first started doing this, did a lot of sober housing, and we would talk about, well, we're going to have house meetings every week, and we're going to have these trainings, and we're going to have this and that, and over time, folks said they stopped showing up and they didn't want to do it. So we, I think, have transitioned to more of the one-on-one, because we can't, when we say we can't force the services on people, what that means is you can't evict someone for refusing to take services. So the onus is on the service provider to make the services attractive to the folks being served, to create a relationship and to show them that there is benefit to them to certain services. You're going to hook them up with income benefits. You're going to hook them up with something that is going to make their lives better. Yeah.
So we have about 4 minutes left before lunch. We can probably take one more question, you think, Katie? Oh, you have a question?
I can use this mic right here, because I did want to just, one of the most frequent requests we get is around senior housing, local senior housing. And I wanted to ask you two about some of the particular hurdles or opportunities around that. Specifically, what is a typical income eligibility for senior housing? Because a lot of times communities, they see people maybe overhoused in their community, they want to downsize. The second thing is, what does supportive services look like for senior housing?
All right. So first question, I think my gut reaction is 50% AMI and under. And when we say it's area median income for seniors, right, they're frequently on limited income. I also think when they're a little bit higher, we sometimes see people have trouble filling those units. So there's sort of, and that's a little of a balancing act, right? Because there are some vouchers you can get that go with 50% AMI units, and there are some that don't. So that goes back to having rental subsidy available for seniors. I think that's really very important. And I think in terms of services, it's a really wide range. So I have many supportive senior deals. One of mine, as a partner with the local ASAP, they provide services to the property for free. They organize Meals on Wheels. They have home health aides that come in and help in the house. They do like free blood pressure clinics. One of my projects has a hair salon in the project so that the seniors can go get their hair done and don't have to leave the building, right? Another project that I have has a PACE center in the building, which means the seniors literally walk downstairs to go to their medical appointments. I think, projects that don't have that benefit can get assistance getting to and from those appointments. So that is we would like that to be for all of our supportive housing projects, right? I think part of those benefits that Emily was just talking about is helping people, sort of achieve stability, right? You're helping them access services, get access benefits, get to their medical appointments, develop their skills. And so I think for seniors, we're looking a lot more in that sort of medical area, the assistance in the home, and sometimes just little benefits like the hair salon.
We'll take
Can I just add one thing to that? I think traditionally, senior housing has been done a lot of times by local housing authorities. So I think if a local community is looking to create probably more senior housing in their community, they should start with their local housing authority, who has access to sources that nonprofits do not have access to. And if it may be simpler to do it with the local housing authority, and that may be the best approach for your community.
Fran Stanley from Groton. I assume that you got your start responding to well-designed RFPs when you're working with towns at town land. And then the second is, I have no idea what ALI stands for 13% ALI that you mentioned. Thank you.
Oh, that's ELI. That's extremely low income, people who are at 30% of median. It used to be all of the funding sources referenced low income, which was 50%, and then in recent years it's moved down to extremely low income for certain funding sources.
Okay, well, thank you, everyone. This was terrific. So good. Grab them while they're here. We are moving into lunch. I guess the secretary will be speaking shortly and doing our Housing Hero Awards, so see you there.
Hi, everyone. We're going to get started in a few minutes, or a second, hopefully. We got a good crowd. The popular topic. Okay. Good afternoon, and thanks everyone for joining us at the session on accessory dwelling units best practices. I'm really excited to bring this panel to you today. It's a really timely matter with the Affordable Homes Act going through the legislature currently. We have 4 panelists today, and starting off with James Fuccione from Mass Healthy Aging Collaborative, the Executive Director of Mass Healthy Aging Collaborative, and followed by Amy Dane from Dane Research, and we will wrap up with Chris Lee, the Head of Design and Development at Backyard ADUs, and my colleague Elliot Schmiedel, Director of Homeownership at MHP, will provide some perspectives as well and facilitate the Q&A. And I'll be running the mics around, so if you have a question, just raise your hand and hopefully I can get to you. All right, with that, I'll hand it over to James.
Clicker clicking, all right. Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for having me. I'm James Fuccione from the Mass Healthy Aging Collaborative. Welcome to our wedding tent / ADU presentation. I feel like I'm giving a best man speech for those who don't know me. The Mass Healthy Aging Collaborative is supported by Point 32 Health Foundation. We're completely grant funded, and if you don't know, that's the combo platter of Harvard Pilgrim Healthcare Foundation and Tufts Health Plan Foundation. They fund a range of food access, healthy aging, and equity in aging issues, including our work to support age and dementia-friendly communities. So a lot of this stuff about our overlap with ADUs, you might know some of this data, but hopefully this will give you more ammunition to work with and more tools to work with in terms of working towards passing ADUs statewide and in your community. So just about age-friendly, how many people know age-friendly communities? That's about my average rate, thank you. This whole movement started with the World Health Organization. It is at its heart, it's a planning effort. It's a community-informed, community-led process that talks about what it means to grow up and grow old in a healthy way, in a productive and inclusive way in your community. At this point, AARP has taken over sort of management and administration of the process, and these are some of just the highlights that ideally age-friendly communities are accessible, equitable, inclusive, safe and secure and supportive, and recognize older people playing a crucial role in community. So there's also a dementia-friendly initiative alongside age-friendly, and this was very confusing to communities. So in our state, we're one of the only states that has combined and aligned age and dementia-friendly communities. And this is the framework that we took from AARP and the World Health Organization. We made it our own, combined with dementia-friendly, but in every community, whether we're working regionally or locally, housing is an issue everywhere. Every community identifies it as a priority, although there's some intimidation of, okay, well, how do we make progress, and how do we keep this forward movement going on housing? And a lot of that ends up coming in through an ADU policy, inclusionary zoning, and all kinds of other ways to promote housing production. So on the Executive Office of Elder Affairs website, there's a toolkit that we have that combines and aligns all of the almost overwhelming amount of toolkits and guides and resources there are for advancing age and dementia-friendly communities. And I don't know if you can see this, but on the bottom right is a screenshot of just some of the housing resources. So you can Google this. It's the only age and dementia-friendly integration toolkit in the country. So it includes all of these resources that I'll talk about from AARP and from other sources, the American Planning Association, that just our communities use to move ADUs forward. And just a little bit about where we are in the movement. We have 118 communities working to become more age-friendly. Once you combine it with the dementia-friendly movement, there's over 230 communities. Many are working in regional collaboratives. So in other parts of the country, you have county-based governments, and they become sort of age and dementia-friendly as a county. We work with a lot of regional planning agencies. Those are some of our best partners, so local and regional planners. And then regional service organizations called ASAPs, a fun acronym for everybody, Aging Service Access Points, and AAA's, Area Agencies on Aging. So you have the physical and social environment sort of collaborating to support people to kind of elevate the practices that are working well and and address what's not working. You see some of the logos of some of the regional work, including MAPC on Cape Ann, Pioneer Valley, the communities on Martha's Vineyard, lots of regional collaboration going on. And we have a statewide commitment called Reimagine Aging. So I dropped some colorful looking business card looking things, and those are to our latest progress report, which is an audio format because we put together these 70-page reports. We don't think anybody really ever read them, so we're trying the audio version, which is sort of an NPR-style news story that highlight a lot of the things going on in communities across the state. So just about age-friendly and housing and ADUs, these are some of the examples that come through on the eventual action plans that get produced. So you see in Franklin County, in the city of Boston through the Age Strong Commission, in Dedham on Cape Ann, they all have work to advance local policies. The Franklin County one's very new, so they're just starting out for those like 20 to 30 communities in that region around Greenfield. But Salem for All Ages was one of the early adopters of age-friendly communities in the state, and they started doing these awareness and education campaigns around ADUs and eventually passed an ADU bylaw in the city. It was contentious at times. It's been talked about for a long time. Christine knows from the front lines. But helping get older adults on board and the aging policy folks and the aging community, the Council on Aging, just getting that whole sector of the community involved is a powerful tool in passing these locally, and we hope passing them on a statewide basis as well. So just some stats, broadly speaking, on that we use when we're advocating for ADUs, and feel free to obviously use these as well. So the University of Michigan National Poll on Healthy Aging, 88% of adults age 50 to 80 feel it's important to remain home for as long as possible. That's something I think we all know and understand and feel and know from relatives and folks we know. 67% of all adults and 79% of those 50 and over want to stay in community. And most want to stay in communities or neighborhoods with people of all ages. So just what people think of as communities, that's where most older adults want to continue to age. So we don't say aging in place, we say aging in community, because oftentimes your home might not be the best place to grow old, but people want to remain in community, close to social networks, close to family, close to familiar surroundings. And so this kind of goes against the misconception that people head down south, go to Florida, or go to continuing care retirement communities, or go to 50. That's great for some older adults and some folks, but most people want to be in a multi-generational community. And speaking of multi-generational, there's the amount of multi-generational households has quadrupled since 1971, and households headed by somebody in their 80s will double by 2040, according to JCHS at Harvard. So more specifically to ADUs, this is an AARP survey. You can see just adults who have or would consider building an ADU are most willing to do so because they care about the following, and most of it is to have a place for a loved one, for family members or friends, to have somebody living close by so they feel more secure. This was done in 2018, by the way, so what we try to elevate is actually these things at the bottom, and I know it's really difficult to see. So at the bottom is providing affordable housing in your community. We're trying to do more education that this is one of the major benefits of having an ADU, to earn extra income for rent. If folks don't know, if you're a single older adult in moderate or poor health, you're among the most economically insecure in the country. We used to be second to last in that category, but now we're below Mississippi as well. And most of it is the cost and availability and affordability of housing that contributes to that. So having that income for rent, being able to stay in your home, in own home, is we see as a huge asset to help with that. And having a place for a caregiver to stay. I'm not sure if ARP asked this as a family caregiver or a professional caregiver, but we advocate for ADUs as an option for professional caregivers to live in places where, home health aides, visiting nurses, and that kind of thing might serve as a housing option. And then that point was highlighted in a recent report from Boston Indicators called Care Work in Massachusetts, a call for racial and economic justice for a neglected sector. So a lot of professional caregivers are women of color, a lot are on mass health, and so most of the conversation around this is about increasing wages, and rightfully so for professional caregivers, but housing is an important part of the equation as well. And so from the report, it says the high cost of living impacts all workers, but is especially hard for care workers whose low wages make it difficult to afford housing where demand for their services is often highest. And so just to continue moving on, because I only have 10 minutes and I could speak for a longer time, is just ARP puts out a lot of resources on all kinds of different things, all things age-friendly, but they have a lot on accessory dwelling units. So I'm happy to send those along to anybody, but it's available on the ARP website. They have a resource library around livable communities, is what they call the age-friendly movement now. There's tons of great stuff on housing and promoting middle housing, promoting ADUs, and lots of different toolkits that are available for all kinds of just different reasons. But through this, I hope you, and all the communities we work with across the state, I hope you will consider working with us and working with your local and regional age-friendly communities to work on accessory dwelling units, to work on other housing issues around availability and affordability. And that was my lightning round, and thank you for having me, and happy to answer. I do have more time? All right. So I know we're going to have questions and answers after, but just to go back to this, again, I think this data is a real opportunity to engage older adults and make sure that older people are involved in local and regional and statewide planning efforts, whatever it is, whether older adults own their homes, are paying a mortgage, are renters, whatever the case may be, older adults can be powerful advocates in a number of different arenas, and housing's one of them. They helped in our community with MBTA communities. They helped get ADUs passed in Salem and other communities. And so I guess that's my kind of closing sales pitch, is that this effort can do a lot of different good. We have tons of examples going on across the state. So hope you'll consider working with us and connecting with us to figure out how this can work in your own communities. So I'll end it there. Thank you very much.
Thanks, James. That was a great presentation. I'm Amy Dane. I'm a consultant in public policy research and writing, and I've been studying zoning policy for a couple of decades now. That was a great presentation on some of the big picture reasons we should be zoning for ADUs, and now I'm going to get into the weeds of how they're regulated. So I've conducted 2 studies of local zoning for ADUs in Greater Boston. The first one I did in 2004, and the second one I did in 2018. In the 2018 study, which I'm talking about today, I look at the 100 cities and towns in the MAPC region, not including Boston, the cities and towns shown here. The legalization of ADUs has been on the agenda of planners and housing advocates for decades. In my research, I've read the master plans and housing production plans and community development plans going back to the 1990s, and ADUs are mentioned throughout. They're like the most common recommendation. Everybody's been saying cities and towns should allow these, and they've been saying it for a long time. In my 2018 study, I found that 68 of the 100 cities and towns I looked at allow for ADUs to be put into single-family homes. Still, 32 out of the 100, after all that advocacy, did not allow ADUs at all. But also note that 31 of the 68 only allow ADUs to be occupied by relatives or caretakers of the homeowners. The units cannot be listed as open rentals. And so that meant that out of the 100 cities and towns, there were 37 in 2018 that let homeowners rent out ADUs on their properties after the decades of advocacy. Note that the research that I'm presenting now reflects the status in 2018. Municipalities have been making changes since then. More places do now allow ADUs, but let's say it might now be more like 45 out of 100 or possibly up to 50 out of 100 allow ADUs to be put in and rented out at this point. It still means that at least half of the cities and towns do not allow for homeowners to put in ADUs and rent them out. Even for the 50% that do allow it, allow them to be rented out, they restrict them so highly. So I'm just going to go through some examples of restrictions that I found as I surveyed them. So in Weston, ADUs can be added to homes that have at least 3,000 square feet of floor area. A smaller home than that can't put in an ADU. In Manchester by the Sea, ADUs can go in on lots that are twice the minimum lot size for the zoning district. So if you have enough land for 2 houses, then you can add an accessory dwelling unit to your single-family home. In Medfield, ADUs can be added to houses built before 1938 that are at least 2,000 square feet in floor area. The median size of new homes didn't get to be that big until the 1990s. Most of Medfield's homes were built after 1938. In Hudson, and actually a lot of towns, ADUs have to have 2 off-street parking spaces. In Duxbury, the primary house cannot be expanded to accommodate the ADU. There can be no exterior changes. In Hamilton, an ADU can take up no more than 15% of the gross floor area of a home. In Westwood, the number of permitted ADUs cannot exceed 2% of the number of single-family and 2-family homes in the town. And in Belmont, I think this is in 2018, I think they may have changed it since then, but ADUs were only allowed to preserve historic accessory buildings like carriage houses. They were not allowed within houses, but that may have changed. When I did my original study in 2004, and this has changed, in Hamilton, they had a rule that you needed to have 10 acres of land to add an accessory dwelling unit to your single-family house. Yeah. So I don't know that you can see all this, but this is just like a list of common regulations, and I'd love to hear from Chris as we do Q&A or as he presents what these regulations mean to him, because he's a builder of ADUs, and I haven't ever built an ADU. I have some friends who have put them in, but this covers some of the regulations I was just mentioning: how old the house is, the minimum floor area of the house, lot size, caps on ADU production townwide, parking, bedrooms, number of occupants, maximum floor area of an ADU, the percentage of the house's floor area that can be dedicated to the ADU, how much the house can be expanded, if it can be detached, or if the ADU has to be attached to the main house, whether it's allowed by right or by special permit. And what I didn't even put here, which is like the hot issue of ADU policy right now, is whether the ADU and the main house have to have an owner occupant in one of them. Now, when I did my research, I thought that was like definitional to ADUs, because basically all the cities and towns where I surveyed them had that requirement in there, and that's just like what an ADU is and why it isn't a 2-family house, because it has to be owner occupied. Then California reformed their ADU policy, and they didn't put that in. And it actually turns out it makes a lot of sense. And it also turns out that the owner occupancy requirement itself is a major barrier to ADU development in terms of financing and other issues. And then all these weird things about why should the government be tracking if you live in your house or not? Like you put the ADU in and then you decide to move, but you don't want to sell the house. And like the government's telling you, you got to like decommission your ADU. It's so complicated, but that's actually another one of these. And now the legislation that just passed the House in Massachusetts hasn't been approved by the Senate yet, but we're working on this, is going to say that cities and towns can't prohibit ADUs, basically have to allow ADUs, and that their ADU policies can't restrict them for owner occupancy. So that's why this is like a huge issue in state policy right now. It's an issue for your local policy too, and that's just not even listed there because they didn't even realize that that's such a critical part of this when I did the study in 2018. So that's like progress and understanding. In my research, I asked if ADUs were allowed as in detached structures, separate, like a backyard cottage, separate from the main house. And in 2018, there were only 16 of 100 that allowed detached ADUs. And there are a lot of people who'd be interested in adding an ADU if they could put a tiny home in the back, but maybe, don't want to put it in the basement or like right on their house or lose windows by attaching it. And also there are products of like tiny homes you can buy and more easily put into your backyard than doing all the architecture of adding an attached unit. So this is like a major barrier to ADUs in and of itself, that most places don't allow ADUs in detached structures. That's huge. Some more have passed it since 2018, of course. So takeaway, local ADU regulation across the region highly limits the number of qualifying homes and discourages people from adding ADUs. In my research, I asked planners, when is the last time the ADU bylaw or ordinance was revised and when was it adopted? And at least 16 had revised them or adopted new regulations in the decade prior to the 2018 publication, so like going back to 2007. And I think we've seen this sort of rate of reform continuing since then. I mean, this has been a major focus. I mean, how many of you are working on ADU policies right now? Yeah, some of you. And there are a number of places like Needham and Wellesley and Winchester and Everett that have been working on them recently as well. So there's been a lot of work, but I just want to point out that this is out of 100 cities and towns that I looked at. And for every city and town that takes this on, it's like they're holding public hearings, they're drafting legislation, they have to take it to town meeting or city council. It's like a major process, and it's like one of many priorities that the planning board and the planning department need to take on. It's a lot of work to get this done across the region, and it's not like it's just needed in 20 communities or 50 communities. Like, we need this everywhere, and it's a low-hanging fruit. It's like relatively easy to regulate ADUs. Like, there are a lot of things in zoning policy that are far more complicated. ADU policy is like really straightforward, and it's straightforward for the building department too to like check off if it qualifies with the zoning. They're like the easiest part of the zoning bylaw for me to read. I'm like, ADUs, that's easy. The other stuff's harder. So this was a big question. I called all the planners, emailed them, called a lot of building departments, and asked how many ADUs had been permitted in the last 3 years. I did this in 2018, so these are going back to 2017, 16, 15. And these are the numbers. I mean, it's like 1, 0, 2. Not a whole lot were being permitted. And then I asked how many ADUs have been permitted altogether, like in the history of zoning for ADUs. And a lot of cities and towns don't really like track that or have that. There were a few places that had like really amazing records, like the Excel spreadsheet that showed me like every single ADU and all the information I would ever need about it. It was beautiful. But it's spotty a lot. We're like estimating very fewer than 30, approximately 5 to 10. You can see, I don't even know if you can read these numbers here. So I'm just telling you approximately 45, approximately 46, at least 45. That was like a common number, I guess. Approximately 57 to 67. Situate 98. Melrose 20. I'd say that the lifetime history of ADU permitting has gotten them like tens of ADUs in general. You know, like this hasn't been like thousands of ADUs. Like, yeah. So for the total, you mean like it wouldn't add up to that? Or if they leveled off? Oh. Yeah, no, there were a few that overall did more, and actually, yeah, so I've got the few places had higher numbers that were like Concord, Franklin, Ipswich, Marshfield, and Wilmington. And there was like one place, I think on this one, like the number looked really high, but it was because they were including renewals, like they had to renew the permit for the ADU. That was like Bellingham or something, I don't know. I don't even see Bellingham here. But that sometimes, oh yeah, no, there's a Bellingham 60. Oh right, Marshfield in the 150 range. There's I don't know the specifics of why like their number's higher than most places, but you know there's a range and there are different regulations and who knows like what's going on in a certain place that more are being permitted. But there definitely was a range, but nobody's saying like, oh, we've got like 1,000 ADUs. And I just wanted to point out, along the way I found like weird regulations and requirements, in particular for units where the occupants need to be relatives of the homeowner, where the units are considered temporary and need to be decommissioned. So for example, in Peabody, the regs say the building inspector will inspect abandoned accessory living areas without the need of a warrant by providing reasonable notice to the occupied applicant on a yearly basis to make sure they stay discontinued. It just seemed weird to me you're going to be like showing up annually. A lot of these regulations like nobody's ever done. I would be like, do these things happen? And the town's like, no, we don't really enforce those requirements that are written down. So that's my presentation. I guess what I wanted to add about like the not super high numbers in Marshfield's an exception and Concord in some places is that like that I think is based on the fact that the requirements are incredibly restrictive. Like I was saying, like only certain houses apply and you have to go through all these hoops and it's an unpredictable process. And so that's why we're seeing so few done. But we do know from California's experience, I was shocked at their numbers for permitting ADUs since they required that cities and towns allow ADUs and allow them liberally and kind of consistently, that you've just seen way more permitting for ADUs than anything we've seen here. And I think that can be the case in Massachusetts. I'm not presenting those numbers to say like, this is hopeless, why work on ADUs? You're gonna get 3. I think that when we have state policy that requires us to allow them across communities more liberally and without all of these layers of restrictions, that not only does that open up more properties to add ADUs, but once you allow it liberally, you can also have more suppliers of ADUs, like more on the supply side, people entering the market because they see opportunities, sort of like, why make that your company if there aren't a whole lot? But we can ask Chris, because he did make that his company while the regulations were super strict. So like, I'm really excited to hear from him because I have never built an ADU. And I'll just, close this out by saying I have a lot of my research up on my website, so I hope you'll check that out. And I've been trying to post a lot to Instagram on like urban planning issues in Greater Boston and different reels, and I'm just experimenting. But I think there's some good content you may be interested in, so I hope you'll follow me there. And I really hope we are able to move the ADU statewide legislation past the finish line, in the next month or two, and that will be a huge victory and really important success for our state. And so I really appreciate all your attention to this issue. I think it's a big one, and there's a reason advocates have been working on it for decades, and we're finally, it's because of all of that work that we're finally getting to this place of making really profound change. So, thanks.
We'll have lots of time for questions after, so please hold your questions. Thank you.
Just setting a timer so I don't go too long. Well, hello everybody. My name is Chris Lee, and I'm one of the founders of Backyard ADUs. Interestingly, Amy's Dane research was the first thing I read, and it convinced me I should try to do ADUs. It didn't turn me off. But luckily, when I got started working on ADUs, I was in the Pioneer Valley, and the Pioneer Valley Planning Commission had done a wonderful job making detached ADUs actually work in a lot of the towns in Franklin County. Not in Hamden, but in Franklin. It was great. So we kind of had some greased runway of being able to get this done. So Backyard ADUs, if anyone doesn't know, we started in East Hampton. We're currently based out of Maine. We're building a lot of ADUs on Cape Cod. We're starting to build a lot in Metro West Boston, North Shore, and in Maine. And we're basically following the towns as they update their rules to make it more reasonable to do. Many years ago, we just fought with towns and made it happen, just to do it and prove that it was not scary. But we try to follow towns that are interested in it, like Concord and Lexington and Salem and East Hampton and Northampton and all of the Cape. And today, in four and a half years, we're building an ADU a week. And next year, we're going to try to build all 10,000 of Maura Healy's ADUs that she wants. I don't know if we're going to get there, but we're going to try really hard. So what I want to do, I kind of want to turn the stage a little bit and assume the Affordable Homes Act gets passed and talk about what's going to be left to do. Because after that gets passed, we're not going to be talking about restrictive zoning anymore, but we're going to be talking about a couple of hurdles that are going to make ADUs a little bit expensive, and we can get ahead of them as we're trying to think through how our town's going to adopt rules and be in the spirit of building ADUs to add housing stock. So I'm going to talk about why I think ADUs should be a priority. And then we're going to talk about existing and potentially emerging barriers that we're seeing in the areas we work in. So the first thing, our ADUs we're subsidizing either with money and our time. And I think there's three tests here that I'm going to look at. Can ADUs scale from a construction front? And I'm going to show you the answer is absolutely yes, and I think it's probably the most scalable form of construction for new housing. And California is kind of proving this. 1 in 4 new houses in California last year was an ADU. And that's resultant of continued effort over the last 10 years to make that happen. The second one, are ADUs something that we want? Do we want these little weird things in people's backyards or above their garages? And then how do construction costs compare? And I think that's one of the neatest things that might be eye-opening that I'm going to look at. So scalability. Once the Affordable Homes Act gets passed, ADUs are by right. You can build ADUs without planning board, without neighbor input. You're only doing building permits. And that makes it incredibly more scalable than trying to permit a new apartment building in any town in Massachusetts. It's extremely fast on that permitting front. Despite a lot of the things that are coming up, even with some processes, it can get done in 4 to 6 weeks. It's simple architecture. We're not talking about designing giant buildings that have to fit into an existing streetscape. We're just thinking about building something that might have a gable roof and decorative gable end returns to match a New England town. It's got low soft costs for this reason, and there's no land acquisition. It's already paid for, so we're not paying $250,000 to build a single-family home or dealing with whatever it costs on the Cape to buy a piece of land that you can build 10 units on. And from a scalability side, where do these go? So this is a screenshot from East Hampton. These are rural, suburban neighborhoods. It's very obvious. You can plop a detached ADU pretty much anywhere. Setbacks rarely get in the way, especially on bigger lots. And there's 1.3 million shovel-ready sites in Massachusetts after we passed the Homes Act. How many sites are there to build new apartment buildings? Not 1.3 million, unless you buy out all the single-family homeowners first. So there's a lot of opportunity. Now, we're not just talking about rural, suburban, big backyards. This is Quincy Center, walkable to the MBTA. Now, I just picked a spot. I was following the red line down out of Boston, and I zeroed in on this one. It happened to be a single-family only zone in Quincy, and I just started looking at the Google Maps and started circling all of the old garages and all of the open space that you could just put an ADU down by right, without neighbors' permission. And there's 36 here, and this is just a teeny little section of Quincy. And again, this is by right. This can just happen. And all you need to do is make it work for a homeowner. And it's a similar calculus to making it work for a developer. There's numbers, there's how much they value their space, and it's possible. Now, this is by right. So if you think, okay, these garages non-conforming, maybe there's a whole thing to get this done. Well, like a lot of towns in Massachusetts, if you have a non-conforming structure, you can generally replace it in the same footprint and not have to go through a special permit process. It's just the code enforcement officer or building commissioner saying, yes, this meets the rules. And in Quincy, you can even go up a little bit higher. So these garages that might only be 300 square foot, we could go 2 stories and maintain the same footprint and not have to go into a planning board hearing. So again, all of these, we could just build them. We could just pull building permits. So it's kind of an overlooked thing how easy this could potentially be. So are these something we want? Do we want these little things jumping up in everyone's backyard? So generally, the development of ADUs is going to be a couple per neighborhood at scale. It's not going to overwhelm a neighborhood or change the character. And when we do that, they're going to be smaller. And we're missing a lot of small units for people's aging parents who are living alone. There's a lot of single-person households. And we need ADUs for the consolidating households. As James has said, that number has quadrupled since the 70s, and that trend's probably going to continue. They're usually accessible when you build single story. They tend to be accessible, and they can be made ADA relatively inexpensively too. Infill, we're reusing infrastructure. We're not building new sewer infrastructure. We're using the same driveway. And in that case of Quincy, we're not adding any impervious space. We're just replacing garages. They're energy efficient. Our houses, we reckon getting to tier 2, mass save, $15,000 rebate, zero energy, all electric, costs us about $8K. So it's not these crazy numbers that are being thrown around to make projects comply with the continued stretch code. They can be done at a reasonable level. And I kind of touched on those other two. Reuse infrastructure, and it gently increases density. So this is another overlooked thing, and this may change with some of the some of the things in the Affordable Homes Act, but they're typically controlled by homeowners. Now, eliminating the occupancy requirements of the homeowner or ownership requirements could potentially change this, and it has to some degree in California and Oregon who have done it. But generally, it only adds, developers come in and they're not automatically buying all of the single-family homes. They're adding 10 to 20% of the volume. So it does help, and it does kind of keep, but regardless, it's controlled by a homeowner. And the reason this is important is small-scale landlords tend to charge lower rents without deed restrictions, and that's been seen in many multifamily housing studies. And this trend it exists in 2 families and 4 families, especially if the owner is there and has to knock on their neighbor's door to ask for a rent check. And the trend continues all the way up to people who own up to 50 units. So they're naturally affordable. Land lease programs were innovated out in Oregon, and they're in use a little bit by some nonprofits, but you don't necessarily have to get rid of an owner occupancy requirement to allow development. You can have a land lease program that allows the developer come in. You can have a homeowner partnership, but you could have a different person developing these if it's not in the appetite of the homeowner themselves. And these are right now built for people's aging family for the most part. So it's adding a severely missing housing type. And that's kind of our bread and butter right now. Most of the ADUs we build, if not all of them, are for people's parents moving into their kids' backyards. And I think the oldest mom to date was 94. So this is kind of the cost. Is this a housing type we want? And I put this in here. There was a Boston Globe article a month or so ago that said the average cost of a new apartment in the greater Boston area was $600,000. It's a huge number. And that only gets built because of subsidy to a lot of degree. Single-family homes have gotten pretty much unaffordable in terms of cost of construction, but ADUs are still relatively affordable. So this is a housing type that can get built at kind of the cost that some of this stuff was getting built 4 years ago. So it's not affordable for a homeowner to do, but if it's subsidized in the right way, it can potentially create a much cheaper per unit cost for a municipality or the state to get a program behind, because the incremental cost to get someone to build this is a lot lower than what's needed to get a $600,000 apartment building to pencil out. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about what some of the barriers are. And you'll find I'm not going to talk at all about zoning, because the Affordable Homes Act is going to ultimately fix that. And I don't say this lightly. We started permitting these things when zoning was a problem, but it was a problem because it made us go through special permit hearings that took months and had unpredictable outcomes. Once they're by right, towns can put simple, no-nonsense rules in place to help preserve whatever they consider is the character of their town. And it's not necessarily going to slow down the production as long as it is simple and understandable. When you start getting creative with how you do living area or average floor areas, it can get complicated, but ultimately, once this is passed, just a simple no-nonsense ADU bylaw that is on no more than one page in a zoning bylaw generally is going to work. And I can answer questions about specifics. There are things we don't like, but for the most part, the things that we're seeing are outside of zoning purview. Sorry to anyone DPW people in here, but DPWs need to be kept in check. And the example I have on here, I've got 3 towns in Massachusetts, or a town and 2 cities, and they all think they have the correct water and sewer policy, and they're all completely different. And they all have completely different implications for engineering and costs, and none of them make sense in all cases for building an ADU. And we've built against all of these. And we continue to build against all of these, and unfortunately, it just means the homeowners are spending a lot more money. And from what we can tell, it's not a plumbing code thing. It's more of it might make DPW's maintenance ability a little bit easier, and it might make water quality safer because they know 100% there's not a lead pipe in the front yard of someone in Concord, where they make you replace old water lines, even if they're copper, just so they have it on record, presumably. But this is a huge problem, and it's propping up. There's kind of a keeping up with the Joneses situation going on, where Concord does this, Lexington does this, Northampton does this, Sudbury's going to do this, and then all of a sudden, you need engineers and licensed excavators to dig in streets just to build an ADU. So huge problem when you're doing your town rules. Do not overlook what the DPW is going to require for getting water and sewer connected. Secondarily, stormwater, also generally a non-zoning thing. Now, rain is getting crazy. We're seeing flooding, but every town is approaching stormwater differently, and it's all water. It's all to do with soils. And a good example that we just learned probably a month or 2 ago on a project we have in Newton that we're working on. Newton requires a Title V level soil analysis before you go ahead and get your stamped engineered stormwater plan to build 600 square feet of impervious space. That's a lot to ask a homeowner to do. It's a lot to ask a developer to do. It's a lot to ask a builder, anyone. What that means is somebody needs to mobilize excavation equipment to a site before they know what they can build to figure out how quickly water is going to permeate through the soil. And it's a really expensive thing, and it's a huge delay. And this is a barrier in Newton to build ADUs. Now, what needs to happen is it just needs to be standardized. Every town can't have their own stormwater rules that somebody has to interpret and figure out how to build to, because it just makes scaling anything impossible. And we gave an example up here. As a builder and a developer of ADUs, we would much prefer to be required to overbuild a stormwater retention pit rather than prove that the exact size is right. So we'd rather build 200% the size of a stormwater retention pit than do all of this upfront planning, just so we know what it is and we know that we're not going to be interacting with 3 different people in the town trying to get the correct answer. Again, this is not a zoning concern. This is outside of that realm, protecting the town in other ways. This fire safety is not as big of an issue in Massachusetts, surprisingly, and this is actually something that stems from our work in Maine. In the municipalities around Portland, there's a race to require sprinklers on everything. New single-family homes, adding a 50% addition to single-family homes, detached ADUs, everything you can think of. And this hasn't started happening in Massachusetts, but it's a good thing to keep in mind because sprinklers are something that are extremely expensive. And while they do on paper increase the chance of survival, it's for the most part a misused statistic because fatal fires are extremely rare in these new houses. And to point to a group that is a group, I'll call it a state, New Hampshire actually just banned sprinklers in 1 and 2 family homes. Actually, I think they went all the way up to 4 family homes. But the state took a position that this data is being misused, and the cost, the incremental cost that it's adding to a new small unit like this is not worth it. And it's it's adding too much to the permitting. So keep this in mind as the fire department and the fire chief starts saying, we need sprinklers because of this data. You've got to drill into it and give a little common sense pushback. All right, I'm going to wrap up with financing. So building anything and making it affordable at the current cost of construction is a function of making the numbers work. It's true for developers, it's true for nonprofits, it's true for ADUs. Now, it's really unfortunate that the Homes Act has no financing for ADUs, but there's hundreds of millions of dollars going to developers to build non-ADUs. If ADUs want to hit the 10,000 ADU target, they need financing. The numbers do not work to create an affordable ADU at current cost of construction unless somebody is 50% there with converting a basement. So there needs to be a financing problem. The good news is the amount of financing that's needed to make an ADU pencil out is a heck of a lot less than is needed for an affordable housing apartment building. And I wanted to throw some things in here because the program doesn't need to be free money. It can be a deferred 0% loan program. The way homeowners think about this, that works, and it can work as a revolving loan fund at the state level. A town could do it like this as well, rather than just giving grants that have to be completely redone every year and refunded. Forgiveness is a nice feature of this if someone sticks to deed restriction criteria. But of course, I'm putting in here, please don't deed restrict, because a homeowner is going to have a hard time deed restricting their biggest asset. And it's got to have an easy application process. So, example in Massachusetts does fund ADUs, just it's on a small program that not a lot of people know about. CDAC runs the Home Modification Loan Program, provides $50,000 at a 0% deferred payment option to build housing for seniors and people with disabilities. $50,000 was great, $100,000 ago in building costs. Unfortunately, it's not enough to help the demographic that needed that to build their ADU. When we were 3 years ago, that program was helping our middle income to lower income customers build for their children with disabilities or for their parents. It's just not enough to move the needle anymore. And there's some good examples. Other than that, Salem has a wonderful grant program, and there are very few strings attached, and they get the money out there. I don't think they've had a lot of applicants yet, because again, it's not quite enough money. They do, I think it's 50 grand. And then New York offers 125,000, Vermont offers 50. So there's a lot of examples out there that are starting. And then to wrap up, these are some of the levels. So 50K forgivable loan. this unlocks a program we've been working on that allows a employer to underwrite the construction of dozens of ADUs and subsidize it. And it could basically build ADUs for employers that can't find housing for employees in Cape Cod and in Western Mass and some of the rural areas. $100K forgivable loan, that's going to kind of allow middle income families to start building these for their parents again, because it's going to allow them to finance a smaller amount at higher interest rates. And then, as with a lot of affordable housing, if you get up into the $150,000 range, all of a sudden, these make a lot of economic sense for a lot of homeowners to donate their side yards to an ADU and rent them affordably. And if we think about how much money goes into affordable housing per unit, it's a lot more than $150,000. But this kind of number is going to unlock a lot of construction. So wrap up, ADUs are buildable. They're going to be really buildable after this Affordable Homes Act gets through, as they've become in Maine, which just passed theirs. And the last step is going to make sure some of these other groups in the town don't create barriers that we're not thinking about. Because we get so focused on zoning, we get so focused on setbacks and the processes, we forget about getting sewage out of the property. And it can create huge problems. So with that, they're kind of easy to build. Let's build more of them. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. Quick round of applause for our three panelists. Nice job. So I don't have any slides, but I want to talk a little bit about what I do in my work and how we're starting to think about ADUs in the financing world. So at MHP, I'm the director of home ownership. My team and I run the One Mortgage for first-time home buyers. We work with state and local partners, nonprofits, and private lenders, banks and credit unions, to make affordable mortgages available for low and moderate income first-time home buyers. Those first-time home buyers inevitably turn into homeowners. A lot of those homeowners are folks that we could conceivably see wanting to develop and finance an ADU of their own. So I just have a couple points I want to discuss on the financing strategies for LMI homeowners, and then jump into some questions for these folks. Good segue, I think, by Chris. Currently, he mentioned that the numbers don't quite shake out, right? $50,000 grant program, loan program is years ago. We're looking at 150 plus now. And if those numbers don't shake out, generally speaking, imagine how they don't shake out for a homeowner under 100% AMI, a homeowner who bought their home with one of the state's affordable mortgage products and doesn't necessarily have the income or the equity or the cash on hand to just fork over and build an ADU. So I think that naturally there's going to be room for some publicly funded subsidies at some point. But I also think there's opportunity for the private lending market to jump in here and create some innovative products that will help meet the needs of LMI first-time home buyers as they relate to ADUs. Because it looks like, if all goes well, we're going to be facing this issue, in a much more broader scale head-on very soon. I think that a lot of the work we do has to do with gaps that exist, affordability gaps, wealth gaps, along race and demographics and geography. And, our concern is that if ADU policy and ADU financing policy is not handled in the appropriate way, that these gaps are going to persist. We don't want to see a scenario in which only folks with means are able to develop ADUs on their lots. We want to create opportunities for folks with less means and with less opportunity as well. So I think we're well positioned as a state, with the work that you all do, with the private lending community that we work with. We know how innovative and creative they can be. Our homeownership financing programs are a testament to that. So we're really excited about this. We've started to take up conversations with a few localities around this issue, not just in anticipation for potential Affordable Homes Act, but on a smaller scale, more locally. So I want to jump into a couple questions for these folks, and then I think we'll open it up and take questions from you as well. Big picture, Amy, so going back to your research, you looked at 100 cities and towns, and about half of them at that point in 2018 made provisions to allow for ADUs. But conceivably, right, if Affordable Homes Act passes, all 100 are going to need to take this issue up one way or another at some point. And I'm wondering how this gets done in a concerted way. And I think, Chris, you might want to chime in here too, and up for any of you. Rather than the slide-by-slide, town-by-town provisions that exist, how far can we go to coordinating this on a town-by-town level?
Right, that's a big question on the mechanics of the new legislation, and I think it's still like a remaining question. The legislation that passed the House directed the state to write implementation guidelines similar to MBTA communities, where they can like write more details about how the implementation would go. To me, I've always favored ADU legislation where the state just kind of directly allows it, and you don't have to go through a process town by town of like holding hearings and writing legislation and getting the votes through. But this is such a straightforward type of regulation that it really is appropriate for the state to just say, like, here are the rules. And then cities and towns would be welcome to allow ADUs more liberally. Like this language that came through the House said that ADUs can be no bigger than 900 square feet. But a lot of the local bylaws and ordinances allow ADUs that are 1,200 square feet, and in Newton, under certain circumstances, it could be like 1,500 square feet. So like cities and towns would be free to do something more liberal than what the state has legalized, but wouldn't have to adopt legislation. I don't know the specifics of how this would be implemented. Of course, I think there's been talk that cities and towns would have the opportunity to write their own bylaws and ordinances, but if they don't, then there would be like a fallback position where the state regulations sort of kick in and somebody could build an ADU based on the state regulations as opposed to the local ones. I don't know, the details of this I think are still getting worked out, and the Senate hasn't passed it yet. And once the Senate passes their own language, I think the way it works is it goes to a conference committee for the language to be reconciled, like, and negotiated across the two chambers before it becomes law. So there's still sort of some time for that state legislative language to change, and then more time for the Executive Office of Housing and Livable Communities to write the regulations or guidelines for implementation. But definitely like to ease up the task on local planning boards and town meetings and city councils to adopt it. And there are rightfully a lot of questions I think people have about we have an ADU bylaw, but it requires by special permit. It's got certain requirements. Do we have to tweak that? Like, what work do you need to do to then come into compliance? And California also is like a case study in this, where the cities and towns did adopt their own, and I think there's some fallback. I'm not actually an expert on California's implementation, but that's sort of an interesting case to look at and how they did it.
Thank you. And Chris, could you underscore just how critical it is to find some commonality if we hope to get to 10,000 ADUs?
Yeah, commonality is really important. So one of the reasons California has been able to build so many ADUs is because one set of rules covers a lot more people. There are a lot of municipalities in Massachusetts, and they all have different rules. So for someone to build a construction company or a architecture firm and build ADUs in municipalities, they have to understand the specific rules and processes for towns of 4,000 people. And if they haven't learned all of them, they learn them as they're going. And I think that's what's important with the state level rules, is it sets guidelines that forces the commonalities. And that's going to be important to allow companies to do ADUs in more than one municipality, which if you look at how the general contracting industry is spread out right now, it's extremely fragmented. And a general contractor that works in Concord doesn't work in Salem because he doesn't know the building commissioner. And that's because it might be the same building code, but it's implemented differently and the zoning is different, and they just can't wrap their head around it. So we need that commonality. And looking to California and the areas where California is not cheaper to build, but a lot of the areas in the South have commonality and it's a lot cheaper to build.
Just also about commonality, the president of Point 32 Health Foundation, whenever she's talking about healthy aging, will get up and say, raise your hand if you're aging. So then this applies to you. And if you're putting restrictions on local rules for this, you're legislating against older adults that want to remain independent in community, or as Chris was talking about, adults with, children living with disabilities also want to be independent, have their own space. Like, you're legislating against lots of different population groups, and it becomes an equity issue in some way, shape, and form. So I think we all kind of share some certain things, and from the advocacy side, we can start talking about that a little bit more too.
Awesome, thank you. Another question, I think, for all of you. One of the most striking things I found in the data was on slide 8, James, that you presented. The AARP study gave those reasons that homeowners would look to build an ADU. And the top 2, I think, were caring for a loved one, providing a place for a friend or family member. And Chris, you underscored that most of the ADUs you built have been for the same reasons. But I think as a lot of us in state and local housing policy think about them currently, it's to build more units. So I'm thinking, as we go forward, how do we make that pivot from serving the folks that want to care for a loved one and friend and family member to much larger scale, different problem that we're trying to tackle? I think that's trying to fuse those two things together into the same strategy seems critical to me.
Sure, thanks. So the reason I put up the multi-generational household stat is because this is an all ages issue, and it's as important for first-time home buyers as people that are older and want to downsize. So I think the knee-jerk reaction, the mental knee-jerk reaction is, well, this is for a family member, this is for caregiving, whether professional or informal, family caregivers. But again, I mentioned the survey was from 2018, and I think a lot of education awareness has been going on since then about how this is also an affordability issue, broadly speaking. So I think it was maybe a snapshot of the time, and I think a lot has been happening through research and through advocacy to make it like a different kind of issue as well.
I would kind of poke at the premise of the question on whether what's important there. At the end of the day, if you build an ADU, and it's an extra housing unit, and whether it's rented or someone's parents living in it, it's still an extra housing unit. So one ADU we just finished in Concord, the mom moved from Lincoln, sold her house in Lincoln. The other one in Concord, mom moved from Bourne, sold her house in Bourne. The one we built in Northampton, she moved back from Israel. Didn't sell a house, but she didn't buy a house in Northampton. So by increasing this multi-generational living, we are freeing up housing use, and we're building houses with capital that wouldn't have been built otherwise. These homeowners, like all of our homeowners right now, are generally paying with cash from a house sale. Before ADUs, that would have bought a condo. It wouldn't have been a new construction house because there's not enough land. It's too hard to do that. So we are going to increase the housing stock just by making this easier from whomever wants to do it. To get to the point where this scales on a rental standpoint, it's just a matter of making the numbers work, just like it is for any other developer. And the good news is, like I had a slide on there, it's a lot cheaper to do that with ADUs than it is with anything else. And the other neat thing about that is we're putting money into homeowners' pockets, which is potentially a lot more sellable than a developer's pockets. And that retains the local control. So we're huge advocates of trying to convince people and states to let's put money into ADUs and make them pencil out and give homeowners a gift and stop giving the developers a gift, because it will spur the same kind of thing. If you make it pencil, they are going to get built.
So I've been hearing that most of the ADUs going in, anecdotally, like planning board members would tell me, are going to be built for family members of the homeowner. And so a question comes up, if like most are for family members, then what's wrong with putting a regulatory restriction in that it has to be for family members? Like, it doesn't really change anything. But I think that for some people, it's like, should you put all that money up front to put in a housing unit that when the family member moves out, you can't even like rent it out? And then it becomes something that like really wealthy homeowners can do that and say, well, then I'll have an office in the ADU, or it'll be a guest wing, and instead of to people who are really like just barely able to afford it, and it really makes sense knowing that after the relative moves out, whether it's your grown kid or the mother-in-law or parents-in-laws, that they can rent it out. And that's like a really important thing. And then there's all this weird regulatory language, like I was pointing out with Peabody. But there were places in my first study in 2004, which was a broader study. I looked at 187 cities and towns. And some made people put down a surety bond with the municipality that after the ADU is decommissioned, when the relative moves out, that the municipality has that money. If you don't remove the kitchen, the city can use that bond to remove the kitchen. I'm like, there's a housing shortage in the region. You're putting down a surety bond so that the municipality can remove your kitchen. It's just like gets into these crazy levels of requirements, restricting it to relatives of the homeowner. So even though like it most often is done for relatives, it's so important that we don't have that regulatory restriction there.
Great, thank you all.
Question.
Questions? Yeah, we're going to open it up.
Hi, I live in Townsend, Mass, and we do allow ADUs with a special permit, and it has to be owner occupied. We don't make people take out their kitchens, but if it's not owner occupied, but we do want, if the family member that it was built for is no longer there, we would like that unit on the affordable housing inventory because we only have 4% and you're supposed to have 10%. That said, an awful lot of houses in Townsend are affordable. Not so much after COVID, but before COVID, definitely. It was a pretty affordable town, not so much anymore, but we need, I guess my question is, how do you get those units on the affordable housing list? How do you require them to be rented as affordable units as opposed to turning your town into a town of apartments where owners aren't required to live in the homes that have the apartments and you wind up with a completely different scenario? As far as the DPW goes, there's no sewage in Townsend. Everything's private septic. And we don't have town water in most places. So when you put that in, maybe you had a 3-bedroom house and your tank just barely handled that. If you're adding a bedroom, you might have to change your whole septic system, which is not, put in a new tank. Maybe not the whole system, but a new tank. So there are, if you make it by right, that's cool. But there's a whole lot of things there. So.
Anybody want to start with that?
Thank you.
I guess I don't know specifically the requirements for having these go onto the 10% qualification so you don't get a 40B development or whatever it might be. If they do get rented, they do tend to be affordable. Just from a standpoint of kind of the duplex effect. You're not going to overcharge your neighbor, or you're not going to remember to increase rent every year to keep the margins going. And in the spirit of that, I guess the step I would take is to look at what are the requirements to be included in the 10% affordable housing stock, and if it is a hard deed restriction or if it's just a reporting mechanism of being affordable each year.
I think it would need to be a deed restriction. So I actually, in my survey, I did see that there were several municipalities that said you can add an ADU if it's deed restricted affordable. And what I understand is like very few ADUs were added in those communities. And so I think it's important that ADUs are like more like naturally occurring market rate affordable units on average, or tend to be more affordable when they are rented out than other rental opportunities in a municipality. So there are benefits and affordability to allowing them. But if you put that restriction that they have to be deed restricted affordable, it really undermines the production and the purpose. Yeah?
Okay, really have a question. If, let's say somebody, builds an ADU on their property, on their home, does that add desirability or hurt desirability of the next buyer of that home, having an ADU there? That's one question. The other was, how does it affect tax bills? How do assessors tend to look at these?
Well, the desirability piece, I think there's a buyer for every home, right? I think at The ADU is going to increase the value of that property, likely. Offers a income-generating unit, maybe offers opportunity to house loved ones and family members. I think there's a lot of pros there. I can't think of too many cons other than upkeep and maintenance.
Yeah, the desirability was part of the AARP survey, and that was one of the top answers, is that it makes your property more desirable if you choose to sell it off. So that was actually, I think it was 4th or 5th on that list, somewhere in the middle, but.
There is a lot of catch-up to do with appraisals on houses with ADUs as we're talking about them, rather than just above garage apartments. And if we go back a couple, I think it was just a year ago, before Freddie Mac updated appraisal guidelines, ADUs were actually just considered a feature of a property and couldn't be fully appraised based on size and condition. And we were seeing them get appraised at 50 cents on the dollar in cities like Portland, Maine, as they were to build. And we saw that because some of these homeowners were going through construction mortgages to build them. And we were astonished. We were astonished at how low they were appraising. But that problem has been fixed because now ADUs can be appraised per square foot and have a condition like the house. But there's a lot of catch up to do, because we have to sell a bunch of houses with ADUs that are of the quality within the neighborhood that the house is being dealt with. So we are going to see a long time before it catches up, and we're going to have to see cash sales occur to get that up. So it's just the nature of, that's a whole nother conversation, is like home sales and everything. But people do want them. We get asked to build new houses with ADUs for family all the time. And in new subdivisions, it's an increasing thing to add an ADU as a rental unit to help pay for the mortgage. So when we're thinking about it from a new starting point, it is a very desirable thing. It's the same thing as someone buying a duplex.
I have a question for Chris while we're here that I've been wanting to ask you. So the state legislation defines ADUs as no bigger than 900 square feet, and you put 800 square feet in one of your slides. Do you feel like that's what most homeowners are interested in, less than 900 square feet, or should the state be looking to allow them bigger?
So our sweet spot's 800 square feet. 800 square feet allows you to build a comfortable 2-bedroom. So the state doing 900 is fine. It doesn't need to be bigger. And towns like Concord and Lexington have special permit processes to go bigger than that, which we're okay with. We've got a couple of those going, and it turns a month-and-a-half planning process into a 6-month planning process, and it's expensive. But some of those homeowners that are downsizing from bigger or are of a higher income bracket, they want the size, but it can get done at 800 square feet.
Hi, my question, I'm over here. Hi, guys. So I'm the island housing planner for Martha's Vineyard, and I want to say that on the Cape and Islands, we're huge fans of ADUs. But my question is, one of the things, we have no ADUs by right on Martha's Vineyard. They're all via special permit. The towns are trying to move towards by right, but what we've seen is that if you don't restrict against short-term rentals, that ADUs just become a feeding trough for short-term rentals. So I'm wondering what is happening at a policy level, at state level, or what could we advocate for to provide a toolkit for regulating short-term rentals accompanying ADUs by right, so that towns that don't know how to implement this in the seasonal communities without opening the floodgates to short-term rentals have an integrated toolkit to implement this in a way that's actually going to work to create year-round units instead of short-term rentals.
I don't know if Christine wants to talk about Salem at all, just put you on the spot, but I think Salem took care of that. I think everybody was concerned about October and other, just being a coastal community, so I think they had some language in that. I can't remember it off the top of my head, but I think there's something in there about that. I don't know if you were.
Are you thinking about how do you restrict short-term rentals and then have the year-round still get built? Is that the...
that when ADUs by right go into effect, they have the tools to make sure that they're being used by year-round residents of the community and not being utilized as a money-generating machine.
Yep.
by a
So what
short-term
we've seen municipalities do, Bar Harbor in Maine does this. I was talking to the planner up there a while back, but there's actually services that you can subscribe to that look at like the Air DNA and the short and VRBO, and they look for addresses and they cross-reference it to a permanent ADU list, and it becomes relatively automated. I don't know how much it costs, but there are actually services that can be paid for so that you're not wondering if what you permitted is actually being used in the way it's supposed to be.
My name is Patricia. I work with the city of Framingham. And prior to working for the city, I worked for construction as a project manager. So I have a very special interest for alternative methods of construction. And this includes construction on shipping containers. So I've always heard of them as an alternative that can expedite the cost of construction, and it includes a solution for construction ADUs faster. And they can also reduce the costs of construction and promote the reutilization of materials, in this case the container itself and other materials that can be more sustainable. But on the other hand, there is a very critical aesthetical impact because it confronts with the architecture and the architecture of most neighborhoods. And we also have the problem of insulation here in New England, and one single container would not probably meet the minimum footage requirements. So I would like to hear from you if you think that constructing ADUs in shipping containers, reutilizing shipping containers for ADUs can be a solution.
Not in New England. So we've seen people try to do that, and I don't even think in other areas it's a scalable construction method. They run up against fitting into code, and it would have to be a code adjustment across the state so that building inspectors can actually accept them. And in terms of affordability, by the time you've insulated them to meet stretch energy code, you've rebuilt the whole thing and you don't have any value of the shell. So in a spot where you're not doing R30 in the walls, R60 in the ceiling, they have a potential to save money on the shell itself. But up in New England, you will not see a scale shipping container company and have that be a affordable housing solution. And I guess they could be made to look good. I've seen a few that are kind of neat, but it takes a lot of work to get there.
Two more questions.
Hi, I just wanted to ask a little more about the 900 square feet, because my sense is that if you were going to build for ADA compliance, you would need sort of like wider hallways and things, and I wonder if there's thoughts that 900 square feet might be too small.
So it definitely isn't. We've done one-bedroom ADUs that are 600 square feet and fully ADA compliant. The neat thing about these smaller sizes is that you don't have hallways. So you don't lose space to wider hallways. You don't have stairways, so you're not losing space to stairways. So really to go from accessible to ADA accessible, you're adding 20 square feet in the bathroom. So it's really not taking that much space up. And then bedrooms, you're worried about some turn radiuses around a bed, and you're worrying about some accessibility to sinks. But 900 is more than enough to do an ADA accessible unit.
We go one. Yeah.
I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the long-term impacts of ADUs once they are successful. So I lived in a 900 square foot home. Parents had to move in with me because of care needs. We moved into a bigger home, 2,000 square feet. We could have added an ADU to that first home. We decided not to because we wanted to leave it for somebody who could buy it as a first-time homeowner. So we just upgraded the home. So I'm just wondering if you have a home that's 1,000 square feet, attainable in a community at the moment that you sell, but you build an ADU on it, all of a sudden that's going to be worth a whole lot more when you sell it. Good for you, but you're essentially taking more attainable homes off the market because they're now significantly larger. So my first question is, what are the long-term impacts on affordable housing going forward? And then the second question, which is kind of related to that, is in some of the, so I work for Old Colony Planning Council. A lot of our municipalities are talking about doing this. Some of them have in different variations. But what is the difference? What do you say to somebody who's arguing that an ADU is essentially a second house on your property? Why is it being treated differently and allowed and permitted differently than just asking straight up through the regular permitting process to build that second home and turn your home into a duplex? Or why is it not just counted as an addition to your home through the regular mechanisms? Why is this something that's special, especially since we're talking about units that have kitchens and are kind of self-enclosed often?
I take a shot at the first question. I think that's a really good question. What are the long-term implications here? I think there's a few considerations to make. I mean, first off, I think number one issue, most importantly, we don't have enough units, right? And so I think that rises to the top in terms of issues, is creating a new unit. I think secondarily, when it comes to the concept of it creating more expensive ownership opportunities, there is a rental component there, ideally, right? So that ADU could be underwritten for purchase, perhaps with the inclusion of, take Fannie Mae standard of 75% of rental income, helping people qualify. Maybe. As a multifamily could be. I think that's an issue they're taking up, they're looking at. The standards are lower than that now, but if this issue gains traction and is more widespread, it's something that could come to fruition in the future.
The other thing I would say, so why are they specialized? Well, it used to be the owner occupancy requirement. That was the deal, and with that being eliminated, it is kind of weird that they're just being allowed and being called ADUs, not duplexes. As far as the affordability thing, I think that's a very possible risk of increasing that $300,000 home to a $450,000 home that someone doesn't have an FHA down payment for. But what could happen without the owner occupancy requirement, and I think what is the experience of out west, is those starter homes are going to become two starter homes on the same property. Someone's going to condoize them. They might even buy two starter homes that are next door, because typically one street is all starter homes, and they'll create 4 condos all detached. And that's what's been done in Portland, Oregon, and places that's how developers are getting involved in this, is they're taking and they're using this as a loophole to subdivide properties and create more starters.
So I'll just go super broad and say that in 2030, for the first time in this country, we're going to have more people over 60 than under the age of 18. If you're on the Cape or if you're in the Berkshires, you blew past that more than 10 years ago. So the demographics, unless you're in a gateway city, your community is getting older. And most of this caregiving is provided by family or friends. We talk a lot about professional caregivers, but there's a professional caregiving crisis. There's not enough people to take care of older adults, people living with disabilities. It's a nationwide issue, and particularly here in Massachusetts, because there's no affordable place for professional caregivers to live. On the other end, I would also say that older people that have an ADU or live in an ADU can also provide childcare, which is also an affordability in the other direction. So there's lots of different social compacty things that are a reason to support this, and by supporting ADUs, we're supporting everybody that can benefit from living in one or having one on their property. So, and by the way, millennials are now the largest generation by size. We are also getting older, so we're going to need all kinds of housing options ourselves. So just putting in a plug and feathering our own nest over here. But this is some of the broad demographic things that we look at in the long term.
I just wanted to add that definitionally, what makes this an ADU policy as opposed to a duplex policy is the maximum square footage, the 900 square feet. Because you could have a policy where we said two-family houses or duplexes are allowed everywhere. And then presumably people could put in 2 units of any size that meet the setbacks. But this is generally, the ADU is most often going to be smaller than the single-family house because most single-family houses are bigger than 900 square feet. Although there are some ranches around and small homes where it could be 2 small houses together. And but it's time to wrap up, and I wanted to say it's been such a privilege talking to you. Love the questions. You're all so thoughtful on this, and thank you so much, and happy to keep talking.
Perfect wrap up, Amy. Thank you. Thank you, Amy. Thank you, James. Thank you, Chris. And thank you for all your questions.
Thank you, everyone. Another round of applause for everybody. And if you want to go grab a quick snack in Wachusett B, the next session will start here a couple minutes later than scheduled. Hi, everybody. This is the last session of our 17th Annual Housing Institute. It's a bittersweet moment for all the staff involved, but we're really excited to bring this panel forward. If you don't know me, I'm Christine Medor, Senior Development Manager at MHP, and just to remind everybody, if you, after leaving the conference, if you want to book office hour with any one of the community assistance team, feel free to scan a QR code that's at the registration desk to book a call with us, and you can also just email us directly or call us as well. So today, our last panel is building a local housing coalition. And first up, we don't have Jesse, unfortunately. He's not feeling so well, but we do have the amazing Cassie Infante that you have just met at the Housing Heroes presentation for Abundant Housing Massachusetts. Cassie is the Associate Director of Operations. And followed by Monica Keel. She's the Municipal Engagement Program Associate at CHAPA. And finally, we will have Monica Gregoire, the Associate Planner of the town of Andover. And with that, I'll turn it over to Cassie to get us started.
Okay, hi everyone. How's everyone doing? It's the end of the 2-day conference. I bet you have a lot of energy. Before Christine corrected who was going to be presenting, I was going to make a joke about how I shaved my beard off for you today. But alas, I am not Jessie, I am Cassie. I'm so excited to share more about our work with you today. And let's just jump right into it. So for those, raise your hand if you've heard of Abundant Housing Mass or you've seen some of our work. Okay, so most of you are familiar with us, which is awesome. Our mission is to stand up for abundant housing in all communities across Massachusetts. So we do that by driving policy both at the local and the state level, primarily working with advocates, so everyday folks that are affected by the housing crisis, and really turning them into pro-housing change makers. And we do that by connecting a statewide network. Who are we? Well, our network, as I mentioned earlier, we started 3 years ago, but we've since grown to over 400 members across the state. Again, those are everyday folks that are interested in not saying no to housing and showing up to public meetings angry about housing, but actually the inverse of that, and supporting housing in their communities. We also have just over 15 affiliated organizations across the state. So what that means is, for us, building a local pro-housing coalition really means laying the foundation of a permanent pro-housing group. Sometimes that's a really sort of informal group of folks working together on common goals. Other times, those are well built out organizations. You might recognize Engine 6, Brookline for Everyone. Basically, we work to build the capacity of these groups, and they join us as affiliates. Of course, we partner with MHP, CHAPA, and other folks to really move the pro-housing movement forward. This year, our work has really focused on organizing and education campaigns in select MBTA communities, thanks to largely support from the Barr Foundation. And we do that with a grassroots focus, because we know that despite the best laid plans by our incredible planners and community development departments, Oftentimes, ambitious housing goals can be diminished, watered down, or sometimes squashed entirely because of the local process, right? And so we knew and we saw this unique opportunity for us to work with communities to enforce compliance towards the MBTA Communities Act. And we do that through organizing, education, again, through a more grassroots approach, which I'm excited to share more about with you today. And we really focus on what we see as the underlying, one of, I will say, primary underlying causes to the housing affordability crisis, which is the lack of supply. We all know the reports and we know the statistics about how many homes we're not building each year. And, you know, I say this because I want to actually share a little bit more about my story. I was really inspired by Meredith's story earlier today around public policy making our lives a little bit easier. My parents immigrated to the United States in the 1980s and were able to buy a home, and their American dream has always been for me to buy one as well. I did that 3 years ago, back when things were a lot easier, right? Back when, even 3 years ago, things were easier. I bought just a humble 400 square foot condo in Haverhill for $189,000. I was in one small way able to fulfill that dream, and it's honestly been life-changing for me as a woman of color, as a first-generation college grad, a single woman who is middle income, and frankly, I don't qualify for subsidized affordable housing, but I also can't afford what's on the market right now. I can't afford a lot of the larger, luxurious single-family homes, and I think we see that experience echoed in a lot of the advocates that we work with. And so that's why so much of our work is focused on missing middle housing and making sure that more folks have this option. I do this work because I want more people to have the option to buy a more moderately priced condo, if you will. And we need to build housing across all income levels. And that's really the focus of our work. And so our vision is abundant housing for all, a housing market that lets people move when they want to, where they want to, not when they have to, communities with racially and economically diverse residents, development patterns that facilitate low or no carbon lifestyles, and we want to educate on effective organizing tools to address our history of racial segregation. We primarily focus on policies that put more housing near transit and jobs, offer robust tenant protections to prevent displacement, reform exclusionary zoning rules, sustainable development practices in communities, and robust funding of social and subsidized housing. So that's more about, that was all who we are and why we do it. I want to share more about what it looks like in practice. And here, these are a lot of words, I apologize. But here's how our MBTA campaigns have been structured and what we focus on in terms of educating and organizing. So much of what we do is about leadership development, working one-on-one with folks. Oftentimes we're in communities where there's only one or a few advocates that are really interested in shifting the narrative around housing in their community. And so we offer things like financial stipends to help offset the cost of people's time, which is, in my opinion, a really important aspect for equity and accessibility, getting more folks into advocate roles. We offer a lot of training, particularly we partner with, for example, JALSA to really help teach folks about the history of exclusionary zoning, racial segregation. And as I mentioned before, for us, a local housing coalition has to start with some type of advocacy group, and we help develop and launch local pro-housing groups. We've done that in places like Watertown, Belmont, other communities, and I'm going to share some more examples later. We help these groups craft website or landing pages to more effectively put positive messaging out around housing. And we do a lot of community organizing. And as we mentioned, communities are very unique. I think we love to say that. Oftentimes there are a lot of similarities too. But we use community-specific strategies. So we'll do things like canvassing or door knocking, phone banking, public educational events. We offer a suite of digital organizing tools for pro-housing groups called Every Action that offers email marketing. It connects to the voter file. So we help give groups access to the statewide voter file so that they can do public voter engagement in their own community. So we're really focused on trying to reach folks that maybe don't naturally come to planning meetings. And finally, in terms of MBTA, of course, we really want to get towards implementation. So we do partner with city planning departments and engage in some lobbying. So core to our ethos is relationship building, because even after the bylaws are adopted, those relationships remain. Oftentimes, something like the MBTA Communities Act can really compel someone to get involved in housing advocacy, right? It's an actionable thing to work towards. But what keeps them there is the relationships and the community that they've built within their advocacy group. And so we really see our job as building the capacity of those groups so that they can live long past our engagement with them. And so what are our tactics, just to get a little bit more specific? These are examples of different organizing tactics that we've utilized that have been pretty successful in, we organize in about almost like 30 communities this year. Obviously lots of one-on-ones, relational organizing, house parties and celebrations. I think it's really hard sometimes, especially when we have a lot of policy losses, to remember to pause and celebrate, but that's a really important element of this work to sustain hope. We've done a lot of text banking. Text banking is such a quick and easy, effective way to reach people in a community, even in places that we don't have a strong pro-housing group, actually in North Andover, for example. Text banking is a really kind of low-touch way to reach people with a positive message around MBTA communities law, for example. Tabling is a great way to meet people where they are. And finally, some lobbying, right? That's really important. We are a C4, a 501c4, so we have some of that levity outside of, we have some of that levity to also engage in some lobbying to get things across the finish line. And so what does it look like to launch a new group? This is our framework for doing so. Oftentimes, we start with one person. We ask them, who do you know that might be interested and has the capacity to engage in pro-housing advocacy? And we form a core group or steering committee that's the leadership. We then work with them to establish their bylaws, a structure, how often are they going to meet, what are their vision and goals, what are their policy priorities. We host a public launch event, and then we conduct our core activities. So this is a very ongoing and iterative process, but I just wanted to share what that's looked like for us in case you're interested in borrowing this or working with us to do the same in your community. Okay, now the fun stuff. So I want to share some examples of what this has looked like, and so the rest of my slides are photos. Franklin is a community where we started off with one person, and I just want to shout out Joyce Mandel, our regional organizer here on my left, who's worked one-on-one with Franklin. And this person felt really alone and was unsure if he wanted to disrupt the status quo and really get folks to join him on this journey. And so it started off with a lot of one-on-ones, going to events like Strawberry Stroll, meeting with folks who rent, meeting with folks who own, going to farmers markets, leading a Jane walk, and now it's a full-blown group. But I want to talk about this photo in particular because it's really powerful. This was the beginning of what is now Building Equitable Neighborhoods for Franklin, called Ben for Franklin. This was an event in which we engaged in the Place It method from this book called Dream, Play, Build, which has been a really strong muse for us in creative community engagement. And so if there's one thing you take away from my presentation, just one thing, it's to read this book. It's right here. It's called Dream, Play, Build. We're big advocates and proponents for it because it talks about Public meeting and verbal engagement, public speaking is really scary. Actually, 75% of people in the United States list public speaking as their top fear. And so, yeah, think about that. We're asking people to show up to meetings, to make their voice heard, or we're asking them to submit written comment, not always thinking about how that's not always comfortable or accessible for people, particularly if you're not an English speaker in this predominantly English environment. And so if you've ever lamented the lack of diversity in the room, read this book, get creative, and try to meet people where they are. So this method was an opportunity to envision what is our mission as a group. This activity in particular was build your favorite memory from Franklin. So a lot of folks built little models of buildings that used to be in downtown Franklin, and it was a really great way to build relationships with people who didn't know each other. And now we have a leadership group in Franklin. It was so much fun. So now we have an 8-person leadership team, and this is the logo for Building Equitable Neighborhoods for Franklin. This was their launch event that you see photos. And then on the right, that is a Jane Walk, which basically explores the built environment in a really sensorial and tactical way. And that's been hugely successful and just so beautiful to witness in Franklin. Okay, Boston. We do also engage in work in Boston. I want to shout out Elvira Mora, our Boston organizer from AMA. We primarily work with affiliate groups or local coalitions for the purpose of this presentation that are represented by the different neighborhoods. So these photos are from an event with Walk Up Rosendale, which is one of our affiliate organizations. Our group in Boston has really been bolstered around the Squares and Streets initiative. Raise your hand if you're familiar with that, Squares and Streets. Cool, okay, Katie. Katie, yes. So our work, Squares and Streets, is basically a Main Street rezoning initiative across a few neighborhoods in Boston. And the work that we've done has included text banking. We advocated for the highest density district to go above 3 stories, to remain in the overall plan. That was successful. So a lot of it has been about mobilizing folks to show up for public meetings, submitting comments, reaching them through text banking. Also in Waltham, shout out to Julia Davidovitz. I have to give the team shout outs because they're the ones doing the work. We started a group called Waltham Inclusive Neighborhoods in Waltham. That is a group of 5 advocates who are on a steering committee, but has since grown into a list of at least a dozen active members, over 80 people on the mailing list. Those advocates have shown up to many public meetings in Waltham, advocating for a housing rights notification ordinance, advocating for new housing at the site of the abandoned Fernald School, and many, many city council meetings. And so this is just an example of a group that, again, started with one person, but through a relational organizing approach, we've been able to really build community. Last but certainly not least, our favorite community to talk about, or the community of the hour. We've talked a lot about Milton. We were very active on the ground working with the Yes in Milton campaign, along with CHAPA, along with our partners. But specifically, we focus on more of the grassroots engagement. We texted over 10,000 people. We knocked on 4,000 doors and turned out 4,000 voters. So even though we ultimately technically did not win from the policy perspective in the referendum campaign, this type of coalition and community building that we accomplished all together will have such a long-lasting impact for the fabric and culture of Milton. So that was, in many ways, a success as well. So that's it for me. I invite you to join us. We have sliding scale membership fees, and our goal is to really empower you to be the most effective advocate you can be. If you know anyone in your hometown that wants to get involved, we would love to talk with them. Here's our contact information, and that's it for me. Thank you.
everyone. Hopefully you can all hear me okay. I'm a fast talker, so feel free to tell me to slow down if I'm going too fast. That's kind of my thing. So hello again. My name is Monica Keel. I am a Municipal Engagement Program Associate at CHAPA, or the Citizens Housing and Planning Association. I'm joined by my colleague Sade Ratliff, who is also a Program Associate, and my manager Whitney. It is unwritten requirement that you have to be named after a singer to be on this team. So, and now I'm going to talk a little bit about our model for coalition building under the Municipal Engagement Initiative. So first, to talk a little bit about our organization, CHAPA. Our mission is to encourage the production and preservation of housing that is affordable to low and moderate income families and individuals, and to foster diverse and sustainable communities through planning and community development. So we do that through advocating for opportunity, expanding access to housing, and developing the field. Over CHAPA's more than 50-year history, we also came out of the civil rights movement, and we have borne witness to the causes and effects of exclusionary housing policies. Due to the history and understanding, we aim to focus our framework to targeting equity and access as a call to action. So why are we so behind? A lot of our work, the Municipal Engagement Initiative, came out of this, was based on reading this report called The Neighborhood Defenders, Participatory Politics and America's Housing Crisis. So some researchers, Catherine Einstein and Richard Rothstein, observed and reviewed thousands of hours of public meetings and examined who was making comments during those housing projects. And this should not be a surprise to you all. Compared to the general population, most of the commenters were predominantly white, male, older homeowners, and they showed up overwhelmingly to oppose new housing developments. These comments were successful to stop the creation of thousands of homes in Massachusetts for those residents, and additionally, resistance from high-income neighbors pushes developments into less affluent communities, leading to gentrification, displacement, and even further marginalization. We believe at CHAPA that housing is the single best investment every community can make in this moment. So unfortunately, as they saw in the Neighborhood Defenders report, this is what we see when we drive around Massachusetts sometimes, and some other states to be fair. But if you don't see these signs on your streets, you can look in your local Facebook groups or community newsletters, and you might find something similar to this in your community. So now to talk about the team I work for, the Municipal Engagement Initiative. As laid out in that report I briefly spoke about, local support can really make or break new housing development, as we've been talking about these past 2 days. Yet many communities in Massachusetts lack a strong pro-housing advocacy group. Our team was founded in 2018, and we work with residents on the ground to change the conversation and support those local efforts in favor of more affordable housing. Each city and town, as we all know, has its unique housing challenges, so we focus on bringing together some big tent coalitions to support affordable housing production. So this is a large yet incomplete list of what a big tent coalition can encompass. We are the Municipal Engagement Initiative. So when we come into a community, we want to be working with the residents, and we also want to work with the municipality. We are not trying to go in and tell you what to do. We want to support our communities and our residents in whatever initiatives they can do. So this list has housing advocates, transit advocates, veterans agencies, social services, racial justice advocates, people who are interested in fair housing, teachers, firefighters, interfaith organizations. Really, everyone has a stake in housing. And if you don't think you do, you really do have a stake in housing, because everybody needs a place to live. So within our Municipal Engagement Initiative, we take on communities in what we call a full versus a light capacity. So first I will talk about a full community. This is a year-long intensive collaboration between the municipality, our team at CHAPA, and the emerging stakeholder group that is based on that Big Tent Coalition. We collaborate with an initial steering committee to create a list of stakeholders, and that's really just telling them, who do you know in your community? Who is trusted? Who are the voices we hear? Who do we want to bring to these community meetings? We host a launch meeting with those stakeholders. We do data sharing based on MHP's research from Datatown. We identify key barriers. We also ask the community to tell us more about their housing story, because as we know, the data does not always reflect what is truly happening in a community. And we also have great group discussions, brainstormings, and some trainings going on. We tend to have monthly meetings in these communities. They're virtual or in person, and in today's age, a lot of them like to be hybrid. So we have like an owl camera that we like to bring. Like I said, we meet with the steering committee to plan those monthly meetings every week or every other week now, and the community really does drive the mission and agenda. I will say, recently, so I'm currently working in Greater Newburyport. They told me they wanted a housing activism 101, so that's exactly what I did. I put together that presentation, we did that training, and now they have more of those tools to advocate through postcard campaigns and sign-on letters and letters to the editor and op-eds. CHAPA provides support through technical expertise, education and outreach, practical hands-on training, and connecting with comparable communities, social media, and whatever else is needed. So right now, in this year, our full communities we have in Needham, so you might have heard about the Needham Housing Coalition and the Greater Newburyport Housing Choice Coalition, so that's more of a regional effort that I've been supporting in Amesbury, Newbury, Newburyport, Salisbury, and West Newbury. And our goal is to assist in the initiatives that the local residents bring to us. In order to be a community, we do have an application process that is on our website page, on the MEI page. This kind of talks about, what's the current state of housing? Is there any organized opposition? Why now? What is timely? Is there a bylaw you want to pass? Do you want to support MBTA communities? So that's what we talk. And we also ask for a letter of support from the municipality. Like we said, this is the Municipal Engagement Initiative, so we want everyone on board. We bring in mayors, we bring in city councilors to these meetings. So now to talk about our light version, and this gives us a little bit more flexibility in what we can do. So many communities need help getting their efforts launched without requiring that ongoing long-term assistance. So these are people that they may already have a group but could use that extra push to get there. So this is intended for community groups that are already underway, need that additional support. So what we do, very similar to the full, we create that stakeholder list, we begin outreach, we hold and facilitate a launch meeting, and we provide some ideas for next steps as the coalition grows. They can talk about the state of housing, they can talk about what's next, what does this group want to focus on. This is typically a 2 to 3 months of more intensive support. So in those 2 to 3 months, we are gearing them up for that launch meeting. And we, of course, continue to support nearly all of our MEI Light communities in some capacity or another. So that could be, connecting them with other advocates in the area, inviting them to our Making the Case calls, which are monthly meetings we have with advocates across the state. And what I like about this is some examples of some MEI Lights we've had recently is an Affordable Housing 101 Plus that we did in the Berkshires last year. So we have this quarterly Affordable Housing 101 session, but Berkshires wanted one specific to their area. So we brought that in and gave them a little bit more of that local context. In Weston, they had a roundtable. They had their second annual roundtable this year. And they just wanted us to work in a kind of consultant kind of role to see how things are going over there. And we've also launched MEI Light programs in Dennis and Northampton. So that was talking about, like I said, that data sharing and getting feedback from the community and giving them those next steps to see what they can do. And of course, for the lights and the fulls, after our graduation, we still support them in any way. So that can include coming back in, doing more presentations, and maintaining those connections. So what does success look like? Here are a few examples upon many, many that we've had. I've also recently been supporting the Franklin County Community Land Trust. They were able to secure grant funding to be a fiscal sponsor of a 3-county housing justice and land justice collaborative retreat. So that included Franklin, Hampton, and Hampshire counties in that effort. And that effort has been continuing after the retreat in a kind of sociocracy model. I cannot explain what that means. We've also seen success in Housing Medford. They supported the creation of Medford's first inclusionary zoning ordinance and is elevating concerns about housing in local elections. In Amherst, their Affordable Housing Coalition successfully advocated for the allocation of CPA funds, Community Preservation Act funds, to support new affordable housing by Valley CDC. As I said, I support the Greater Newburyport Housing Coalition. They've successfully advocated for MBTA community districts to pass in town meeting in Newbury and Salisbury thus far, but we have more to come by the end of the year and the end of 2025, as we have a couple of adjacent small towns in our coalition. We also had success in Lynn with their housing coalition. They successfully passed a housing production plan after months of stalling and supported a pro-housing mayor through a candidate questionnaire. So other ways to measure success. Thinking about member retention, are people still showing up to meetings? You know, what else can they do? Showing them that there are ways you may not be able to come to a monthly meeting, but maybe you can sign on this sign-on letter, take 1 minute, take 5 minutes to take action. Thinking about that involvement. Have there been any local zoning changes, conversation changes that you've heard? That overall attitude. And I wanted to give a special shout out to the Andover Housing Coalition, where they graduated last November, but recently they were able to tap back into that network to advocate for their MBTA community's law to pass, and it did. Yeah, applaud. So some lessons learned, and again, this is stuff that other people have said these past couple of days. Start the engagement process as soon as possible and incorporate the community into planning. You don't want to show up and say, this is what we're doing, give us feedback, but it doesn't really mean anything because we can't change it. They should be a part of every step of the process. Build off of momentum. What's going on locally? If there's an ongoing effort you can join forces with other groups. Always take time for self-care before burning out. You have to take care of yourself before you can take care of others. Talk about timeframes for engagement. Like I said earlier, maybe people only have 5 minutes of their day that they can give to you. Try to tap into that as much as you can. Be open to last-minute changes to your agenda. There could be anything that happens. There could be something that happens and, hey, we need to prepare for this in town meeting. There's an amendment that was just filed. We're here to help. We're ready to go. Talking about that art of the pivot like earlier from the case made. Focus on values and goals, not numbers. This is more specifically talking to the MBTA communities. I think people were talking earlier about those personal stories, sharing that really resonates with people. Asking them, who are we as a community? What do we believe? And I believe someone else said earlier that the character is not the buildings of a community, it's the people that live there. Provide images and metaphors to help people visualize, showing people what the density is. They could be walking by an affordable home for their entire life and not know that it was affordable. That happens all the time. Don't overestimate how much people know, and don't make assumptions about what they know. Nobody knows everything, but together we of course know so much more. And don't waste time trying to convince the inconvincible, because it can truly be a losing battle. And that is all I have for y'all today. If you want to stay connected, I have office hours on Thursday afternoons and Friday mornings, but you can feel free to shoot me an email if you'd like to schedule with me outside of time. Outside of that time, we have free and open webinars called Affordable Housing 101 and Confronting the History of Housing Discrimination in partnership with the Jewish Alliance of Law and Social Action. And you can find all of that registration information on our events page. Thank you.
Hi, can you hear me? All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Monica Gregoire. I'm associate planner with the town of Andover. We had the pleasure of working with CHAPA on our MBTA communities legislation, and I just want to take you kind of through our journey. And so in recent years, community engagement has actually been a really important part of any zoning changes that we've made. Approximately 10 years ago, the voters actually voted positively to enact some new, rather dynamic zoning modifications in Andover. Andover is a primarily single-family, large lot development community. In our downtown area, we actually had our old town hall, yard in our downtown area. You know, we kind of thought, is this really our highest and best use? Should we have in our downtown, pickup trucks and salt and things like that, or could this be something greater than that? And so, working with the community, we actually developed new multifamily mixed-use zoning, which actually allows for 40 units per acre mixed-use development. But it didn't qualify for MBTA communities because, of course, it had to involve a special permit. And so, throughout the process, the community became involved in this process after numerous meetings, tours, charrettes, focus groups. New zoning was established. Many of those that actually were engaged in this process actually stayed engaged. And once we heard about the MBTA communities law, as well as CHAPA's MEI program, we figured this is a great program for us. This is a way to build upon the coalition that we've already sort of established under this previous zoning. And so this group met monthly, learning about the history of zoning, discrimination, why does our town look the way it does? They were with us from the beginning, from when the law was enacted to the very end of town meeting. And so this very slide actually shows right before town meeting, the group came together. They developed signage, which was throughout town. They developed flyers that were submitted around town, and they helped us to get the word out to the community. They also became part of an MBTA communities working group. Again, you could build zoning from the top down, but do people really want that, or do they want to be engaged in the process? We figure a community is made up of people. The guidelines were relatively loose, which actually gave us an opportunity to create zoning that reflected Andover's values. And so we put out a call to the community. We initially thought that we would have a small group of people representing various groups because, again, we really wanted to involve as many different types of people as possible. We received actually 30 applications, which again presented a good problem, I guess. A lot of people showed that they were interested in this. So instead of having a group of 7 to 9 people, we decided let's take on a few more people. We had a group of 17 residents working on this group. We met at least monthly. Sometimes we met twice monthly. We incorporated, we had members of the planning board because, of course, they're responsible for the zoning. We wanted the school committee involved in this as well because we knew people were going to say, if you're introducing new housing, they're going to, inundate our schools. So we wanted to make sure that they were part of the process. And of course, we had many of the housing advocates that were working with us previously. And so here's just a group of some of our members on a site tour of one of our areas near one of our transit stations. And so what we did at town meeting is actually we settled on 3 main districts throughout town. One is our downtown district where we have our major train station. We actually are lucky enough to have a second commuter rail station. And then the third, we have an industrial area, which initially I thought, wow, there's no transit there. But as we actually investigated this area, we figured out that it actually made sense. Only 50% of our new units needed to be near transit, but maybe this is an opportunity to build up this other area. So now I'm going to kind of take you through each district, kind of talk to you about the engagement and what we heard and how the plans evolved. So again, as I mentioned, our zoning was actually based upon kind of the seed that was planted under the establishment of the historic mill overlay district. So that would be the red area that you see there. That again has some of the most densest density in town under a special permit. We hadn't seen any permits actually come before us. Actually, we're reviewing our first one now after 10 years. We figure, well, maybe there's an opportunity to encourage maybe small scale development in this area. So we took our working group out. We started having meetings with the community. We started having tours, kind of talking about the existing density. We played a game that I like to call, how dense is this parcel? Because no one understands what 15 units per acre look like. So they didn't realize that they were standing in front of buildings that maybe were built in the 1890s that were above 15 units per acre. So we wanted them to have an early understanding of what the state was looking us to do. A lot of, this area, some people said, great, let's go for it. But again, we actually received pushback, believe it or not, from some of the residents in this area. Some of the things we heard were, whoa, you're putting extra density in this area. Why don't we spread the wealth throughout town? And so we started to rethink about where the zone would be located. Maybe one district wasn't going to work in this case because we have to go through town meeting. We were eventually saw that under the previous zoning development might happen. Maybe we should spread the wealth. And so we now looked at and I'm actually going to show you a couple pictures. So this is just what we have downtown. We have our historic mills, which are partially redeveloped. We actually have an old 70s shopping mall. And we thought, why don't we encourage them to redevelop this? Maybe this, large parking lot with the strip mall could be something higher. Maybe it can be mixed use. And so those are some of the discussions that we had with the working group in the community. Then we went to the south of town to our second district, which is located in Ballardvale. And I'm from New Jersey. I pronounce it wrong, so forgive me if you know how to pronounce it. But this area is actually one of our smaller areas. Within half a mile of the transit station, there's approximately 500 housing units. So there's not a lot there. Once we went to this area and started talking with residents, they were actually thrilled that we were considering this area. One resident even said that, he'd lived in the area for 30 years and had seen very little development, so he was excited. And so this area is very unique. It has another historic mill, which hopefully will be redeveloped into maybe some mixed use or residential uses. Behind that mill is actually an industrial yard and large parking lot. And so again, residents in the abutting properties look across the street, they see kind of, piles of dirt. They're like, maybe this is something that could be residences or building. Behind that is actually the river, which is beautiful, and it connects to conservation land. So maybe instead of having industrial uses by our river, maybe this is an activated area. So over time, that's something that might happen in this area. So, as I mentioned, a third district came into play. We had to create a unit capacity, and we have an area that allows you to stay in the hotels. You can buy your coffee at the local gas station. You can eat at the Chili's, but you can't live in this area. And so that would be our River Road district. It is zoned industrial. We went out and talked to the employers in this area, and they actually were thrilled. They see their workers coming in, driving in to work and driving out to go home. They said maybe this is an opportunity to actually provide housing for the employees, so maybe they could walk or bike to work rather than just tying up the roadways. This area is actually sparsely serviced by transit. There is a local or regional transit agency, MIVA, that actually provides early morning bus service and late evening bus service, and that services the hotels. So workers from Lawrence actually ride the buses to work, they do their shift, and they ride home. So maybe this is an opportunity to provide housing that, maybe they might take advantage of. And over time, with increased density, there might be an opportunity to increase transit, taking people off of our roadways. So, once the law was passed in 2021, our first task was actually to alert the community that this happened. And then we heard what the guidelines are, and that is when our working group got to work. We had, over the past 2 years, I want to say more than 75 meetings. And so those were listening sessions, district tours, workshops, information sessions, public meetings, lots and lots and lots of pop-ups. We've been to coffee shops. We've been just to various places in the community. We even made use of, we have a mobile town hall, which you see the little blue vehicle, which definitely catches your attention. There's even strobe lights on it, which I was shocked when my supervisor turned those on, but it got people's attention. And we stood outside of these locations handing out flyers, answering questions, just making sure we met people where they were. Because again, we wanted people to make sure that they understood what the law was, what the law was not, what this meant for Andover, and actually hear from people, what this meant to them. And a lot of people were thrilled because housing is so expensive, especially for Andover. This is the type of thing that might open up opportunities for them as they age, or even as their children, come back, hopefully, to the community. And so here's just a snapshot of some of our engagements. So we got to town meeting. It passed overwhelmingly. Even the people that stood up at the con mic had relatively positive things to say. I mean, one person even stood up and said, you know what, I'm not against these zones. You guys went out in the community, we helped to shape this, we changed things in a way that you listened to us. The only thing he said was, why are we doing this now? Why don't we wait to hear what happens in Milton? The community obviously did not agree. So next steps. We're building upon the momentum started way back 10 years ago and continue through this process. The community and the working members are interested in addressing accessory dwelling units. So hopefully the state officials will help us out with this. Hopefully that'll add some additional opportunities. We have family dwelling units available right now, which actually involves submitting a doctor's note, which is a little over. I was a little shocked when I heard that. You have to rip out your kitchen. People are saying when they're no longer used, why don't we rent these out? We're also looking at our inventory of properties to see if there's some way to turn those into affordable housing. So that's where we are right now, and I know we wouldn't have gotten there without the work of the community. So we appreciate them as well as the assistance through CHAPA. So thank you.
Thank you, Cassie, Monica, for those wonderful presentations. We're going to open up for questions, and Katie will have the mic. All the way in the back, Danielle.
Hi. Ooh. Hi. So it sounds like you guys have everything you need to get it all done. You've thought of all the things and are out there doing all the things, but I'm joking, of course. So I'm kind of curious what other tools, if you could wave your wands, you would want out there as you're engaging with municipalities and the communities. Do you have a wish list of things that, if you had more time, more resources, you would deploy? Would there be more? Would there be 300 mobile town halls? I love that one in particular, but I'm just curious to hear about that. See what else is on your minds.
I can start if that's okay. So something that's on my wish list is more money, but specifically to give to our advocates. People are vulnerable, very vulnerable when they're sharing those personal stories. They're giving us our time to advocate. These are all volunteers that we work with, so compensating them for their time, I think, is very crucial to show that, of course, it is important, the work is getting done, but to compensate them as well.
I would absolutely second that. I think, for us, we had folks who are single parents and needed help paying for childcare to show up to certain events, and I think the stipends we were able to provide helped offset the cost of that a bit. We've set up childcare. There's actually a collective based out of Greater Boston that my colleague Julia brought to my attention that provides childcare for these types of community events. I can share that information if anyone is interested. I think in general, my wish list is always to make community engagement more accessible and inclusive. I think, to be honest, I say this in the most loving way, but sometimes we just sort of blame the folks that aren't represented for not being there. And I think that's a really big mistake. Like I said, not everybody has time to go to town meeting all night, especially if it's the last agenda item. and make their voice heard. So, and also I didn't mention this, but language-based engagement, it actually, something that book talks about that I referenced, is it engages the part of our brain that thinks about fear most often. So you're thinking about the traffic you sat in to get to that meeting. You're thinking about more people, scary, oh my gosh. But we've had so much fun with more like tactical forms of engagement, getting creative. I really wish, if I had a wand, I wish we created the time and space for that. To inform master plans, to inform zoning bylaws, community plans, that sort of thing. So I'll pass it off to Monica.
Great, thank you. I can say, as you mentioned languages, I mean, in looking around the room and noticing who wasn't in the room, we noticed that it's very clear that the room was very much the same population. Towards the end of the group, we were able to bring in some younger people. We brought in, some ethnic diversity, but not much. We definitely have populations that are, their primary language is not English, and it would have been great to actually bring them into the process, maybe with some more literature that was in their native language, maybe some translation services. But again, in terms of community engagement, our goal was to get as many people of different groups in the room, and I think that if there was access to more, or at least we know where to get these services, it would be great to expand upon that. Childcare. Meetings happen, of course, at 6 o'clock at night when people are trying to feed their kids and tuck them into bed. While we took the mobile town hall out, we tried to meet people in different locations. I feel like there's always more that can be done. And so in looking for maybe childcare, we might be able to bring more people into the meetings and get them more involved. So I would say that's something that would be beneficial.
Follow up, sorry. How important has it been to be able to have the option of hybrid meetings?
Very. That was definitely when we first had our kickoff meeting, we had a hybrid meeting, which actually we were able to have basically 2 meetings simultaneously. I would say our first meetings was one that actually had both younger people and older people. Once we shifted into in-person, we had very great meetings. And so I think having that hybrid brings more people in, because you can, feed your kids while attending a meeting. I mean, what's better than that?
Owl cameras are life-changing. They are great for hybrid meetings.
Another question? So I have a question, actually. So we already learned about several successes and maybe a couple of failures in some of the stories that you shared. And I'm wondering for each of you, when a campaign for a vote or a policy change fails and you already have built a significant momentum with your local coalition members, how do you continue to keep them involved? What are some of the strategies to maybe help some healing and help them to stay engaged in the process? Because we all know this is a long game. So what happens after something fails, and how do you keep them connected to all the issues?
I can speak a little bit for our experience supporting the Yes in Milton campaign that, lost the referendum campaign, and it was really hard on community members there, especially after engaging in a very comprehensive, intentional, well-organized campaign that fundraised, I think, around $20,000, if not more. 30, my coworkers, yeah. They just put in so much effort, and it was such a disappointment. Honestly, it sounds so simple, but just really reaffirming people, sending thoughtful notes, meeting people in person, showing that there's a human side of this and that in many ways there's still winners. Like, we were really intentional in our messaging to say, like, there's still a lot to be hopeful about in Milton, and there's like great people there that wanted this to happen. There's amazing work that's happening. So we did that through blog posts and our messaging as an organization, but also just like comforting and affirming the advocates there. We also hosted an event for the AMA network where Milton advocates were able to share more about their campaign. And so giving them the opportunity to uplift and share the lessons that they learned and all of the mini successes they had, like with fundraising, because fundraising is hard. And so the fact that they were able to just fundraise $30,000 in like, what, 2 months? It was a really short amount of time. And giving them the opportunity to work with other advocates who might be in a similar position was really empowering for them. So I think it's just all of those like relational pieces that sometimes we forget about in the hustle and bustle of the work that can really make a big impact.
I would just say, when talking with advocates and a failure is reframing it as another opportunity, just like in life, there are failures, but we have to learn from them and grow, and it's not the end of the fight.
I'll just quickly add that Andover has tried zoning to allow for multifamily housing in the past. The Historic Mill Overlay District failed, I think, 3 times before it was passed. And the community came together, learning each step of the way what to do, and eventually it passed. They failed for accessory dwelling units in the past, but they're still hungry for it because they know that there's a need for it. So I think having a coalition that's just determined to make things happen is, even if you fail, that's just a moment to kind of dust yourself up and try again.
I'm going to say one last thing, which is helping people stay out of the Facebook comments is really good for mental health. Like, it is so dangerous and such a slippery slope. And we've had people say, like, man, there's people saying such bad things about me. I'm a zoning board member in Haverhill. Like, I've been attacked in the media as well. I just choose not to look at the comments and instead focus on what's my positive vision that I'm putting out for housing in my own community. And so, Monica said in her presentation, like, protecting people's mental health, taking care of ourselves. Not everyone is cut out for this, but finding like those, we all talked about it, finding those small or big ways that people can make an impact in a way that suits them, I think is also a way to take care, especially after a win. Also, last thing, failures mobilize people like you wouldn't believe. Like, it's exactly as you mentioned. When things are bad, it actually brings people together more in a way for the next battle. And I keep saying in Milton, like, it's not over till it's over. We'll see in the fall, and I still have hope.
Thank you. I have a question over there.
As much as I understand and value and acknowledge the impact of your work, I also understand how difficult it may be to measure the impact of your actions and programs. So my question is, have you developed or implemented or thought of any metrics or any way to measure the impact of your actions and keep track of them in the long run?
Yes. So as I said in my presentation, member retention, if there's a Google group, how many people are still in that Google group? Some of these coalition could be meeting monthly and only 10 people show up, but they have a Google group with 200 people that are still responding. People will say like, hey, I just can't come to this meeting because I have a zoning board meeting that same night. So looking at that, again, showing people that there are so many ways to be involved. You don't have to come to a 2-hour meeting. You can engage for a minute. You can engage for 5 minutes. And still just being able to tap into that network, I think, is a way to measure that.
I think for us, we're a really nimble, tiny nonprofit. And so the short answer is no, we don't have like a great system for tracking metrics. I know, and so our goals are really around learning and testing new things out. So much of what we've done this last year in MBTA communities has been experimental. But even just sort of converting someone who had no pro-housing advocacy in their background to becoming a leader in their community, those are the type of metrics we're looking at. And also just, again, almost like MEI as well, we're so similar, is seeding the launch of these new pro-housing groups that can exist past us. So after MBTA compliance, what's next? Maybe they have an affordable housing trust. Maybe there's another like zoning campaign that they want to work on in which we can continue supporting them. So we want to build as many of them across the state as we can. So that's a really important metric for us.
Another question over there.
That's okay. I'm Virginia Rio. I'm from North Adams, and we are just at the beginning of building our housing coalition. And I felt really gratified that we were doing the things that you said we should be doing. But I guess I'll make two comments about sort of what we've experienced. One is that the people in the community, because there was no focus, nowhere on affordable housing activism when we started, and we only started in November. But the second that people saw that there was somebody who was really committed to working on this and that we filled the vacuum, or we wanted to fill the vacuum, they came right away to be part of it. And I think that's something to recognize. You may be sitting there thinking, why isn't something happening? But as soon as you, like that match, then people will go. And I think that's linked to my second comment, which is, I think that at least North Adams and probably other communities have suffered so much for so long with the loss of industry and being unemployed and feeling that they have been failed over and over and over. You know, it's very hard for them to get up in the morning and say, I'm going to start Affordable Housing Coalition, or I'm going to do this, and I'm going to, and so you're building hope too. And even if you have setbacks, I think that building that hope in the community is so important to so many things. And so just to anybody who's trying to do this work, I think that there are these other pieces about this that aren't just having meetings, but creating a different cultural environment, and it's a gift to the community.
Thank you for that comment. I really want to highlight what you said there about the connections. You know, people are able to connect with each other and maintain those relationships. I think that's so crucial. You know, inviting your neighbors, the people you went to school with maybe, is so important, because those are the people you're able to keep in your corner during those failures and losses. Like, we're still able to come together, have casual meetings and say, you know, what can we still learn from this? So thank you for that.
All right. Oh, we have a Sade.
Hey, already come.
I personally just want to say thank you to both of these organizations. I think that even on the back end, in terms of the things that they're doing and their hiring practices and the people that they're letting into their door, they both offered me incredible opportunities, and like they changed my life. So they're not just changing the lives of people in communities, they're creating like mini professionals, and they're making mini thems. And I think that the way that you guys are revolutionizing your industry that you work in and nonprofits in general with your hiring practices and your work practices need to be uplifted and commended. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Yeah, I'll just add, you know, applause for Sade, of course. I actually started with this team as an intern in 2020, became a Spanish translation consultant in 21, and I've been full-time for over a year. So if you were to tell me this is where I'd be back then, I'd say this is exactly where I want to be. So thank you for that.
Agreed. So that is it. Oh, anyone else have anything to add? Okay. So that is it for our session, our final session of the entire Housing Institute. Woo. We do have some wrap-up remarks and reminders back in the big room, and we would really, really appreciate if you give us feedback. There's a QR code on one of the table stands. On your table, the bottom one is the feedback form, I believe. If you scan that, it takes you directly to the feedback form. Tell us what we did great on and some things that we need to improve on. Tell us what you think of this new location. This tent was not our plan. This is a backup plan. We would also love to hear from you any kind of simple details that would have made your attendance much more comfortable, enjoyable. So anything you can think of, let us know. And any sessions that you felt like, oh, maybe next year, not so much, or yeah, do more of this next year. But every year we do this, and this is our first time coming to Worcester, leaving Devon, so we really love to have some feedback to inform us on how we can make this better next year. And with that, and you want to take a break here before you go back to the big room, feel free to do that. But thank you again for attending, and we love seeing you all, and hope you come back next year. Another round of applause for our panelists. Thank you so much.